My name is Nia, 32 years old, and until recently, I was the designated doormat for my family, while using the restroom during what was supposed to be a luxurious family bonding trip in Chicago. I accidentally overheard my parents and my sister plotting to completely destroy my life and steal my company. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would just put my head down and take the humiliation like a good obedient daughter. They were wrong. Later that week, my father called me absolutely screaming into the phone asking where the hell I was. I just answered calmly, telling him to take a guess and asking if the family enjoyed the gift I left behind on the bed. A second later, I heard my mother scream at the top of her lungs in pure terror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who tried to use your success for their own selfish gain. The nightmare started exactly where most of my family interactions began, with me standing alone in the pouring rain holding the bag. Literally. I was standing outside Terminal 3 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The sky was an ugly, bruised purple, and the rain was coming down in sheets bouncing off the concrete and soaking the hem of my trousers. My flight from Atlanta had been delayed by 2 hours due to a severe Midwest storm system. I was exhausted. My feet ached in my heels, and all I wanted was to get to the luxury lakeside penthouse I had rented for this so-called family bonding trip. I pulled out my phone, wiping the raindrops off the screen to check my messages. I expected a text from my father, Calvin, telling me they were circling the passenger pickup lane waiting for me to walk out. Instead, I saw a text he had sent 20 minutes ago. It read, "Hey Nia." We took the rental SUV and headed to the penthouse. The humidity out here is crazy, and Chloe needed to get out of this weather to save her silk press. "We will see you at the rental. Grab a cab." I stared at the glowing screen as the icy Chicago rain plastered my hair to my neck. I was the one who had paid for that luxury rental SUV. I was the one who had upgraded it to a premium model so my parents would have extra legroom. I was the one who had planned this entire trip to celebrate my mother's birthday. And yet, because my 29-year-old sister was worried about her hair frizzing, they had abandoned me at one of the busiest airports in the country during a torrential downpour. I did not scream. I did not text back an angry paragraph. I simply locked my phone, gripped the handle of my suitcase, and walked toward the designated rideshare pickup zone. This was exactly what I had come to expect from my family. By the time I finally secured a ride, I was shivering and completely soaked. I slid into the back of the sleek black car, murmuring an apology to the driver for dragging the storm in with me. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, offering a sympathetic smile. "Rough weather for a family vacation," he noted, seeing the luxury tags on my luggage. "Do you have family waiting for you at the hotel?" I looked out the window at the blurred city lights streaking past the rain-slicked glass. I let out a dry, humorless smirk. "Something like that," I replied softly. "Family." The word always felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket when it applied to the people sharing my bloodline. To the outside world, the Williams family was the picture of African-American excellence in our Atlanta community. My father, Calvin, was a highly respected elder at a prominent megachurch. My mother, Vivian, was the head of the church's events committee, always immaculately dressed, always projecting the image of flawless upper-class grace. And then there was my younger sister, Chloe, the golden child, the socialite, the influencer who projected an image of immense wealth despite never having held a steady job in her life. And me to the world. I was Nia, the highly successful forensic accountant, who had built a multi-million-dollar auditing firm from the ground up. I handled the financial secrets of some of the most powerful corporations in the South. I was feared in boardrooms and respected in the industry. But to my family, I was just the unmarried workaholic disappointment. I was the bank, I was the safety net, I was the disposable daughter. As the car navigated the slick Chicago highways, my mind drifted back to the exact moment I realized my true place in the Williams family hierarchy. I was 18 years old. I had just been accepted to Spelman College, my absolute dream school. I had worked tirelessly throughout high school, sacrificing social events and weekends to maintain a perfect grade point average. My grandfather, before he passed away, had left a substantial college tuition fund strictly in my name. It was my ticket to freedom and a bright future. But 2 weeks before tuition was due, my mother called me into the living room. Chloe, who was 15 at the time, was sitting on the couch sobbing dramatically into a tissue. Chloe had taken my mother's car out for a joyride without permission, hit a parked car in our affluent neighborhood, and fled the scene. The owner of the car had security footage and was threatening to press serious charges that would ruin Chloe's spotless record and destroy my mother's pristine reputation at the church. I remember standing there clutching my college acceptance letter as my mother calmly explained that she had emptied my college tuition fund to pay off the car owner and cover the massive legal fees to keep the incident entirely quiet. "You cannot do that." I had begged, the tears burning my eyes. "That money was for my education. Grandpa left it for me. I need it for Spellman." My mother, Vivian, had simply crossed her arms, her expression utterly devoid of sympathy. She looked me up and down with a cold, calculating stare that I would never forget. A strong black woman makes sacrifices for her blood. Nia, she had told me, her tone dripping with self-righteous authority. "Your sister made a mistake, and we have to protect her future. You are smart. You do not need a fancy college fund to succeed. You will figure it out, you always do." I did not go to Spelman that year. I went to a local community college while working full-time at a tax preparation office. I spent my nights studying and my days analyzing financial spreadsheets. I learned to track money to see where it flowed, how it was hidden, and how it could be recovered. I transferred to a state university, paid my own way through scholarships and relentless grinding, and eventually became a certified public accountant. Then I specialized in forensic accounting. I did exactly what my mother said. I figured it out. I built an empire with my own 2 hands. I had more money in my accounts now than my parents had ever seen in their lifetimes. But the pain of that betrayal had never left me. I never forgot the casual cruelty with which they sacrificed my dreams to save Chloe from the consequences of her own actions. "We are here, miss," the driver announced, pulling me out of my memories. I paid the driver, adding a generous tip, and grabbed my luggage. I stood on the sidewalk looking up at the towering, ultra-luxury high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan. The penthouse suite cost me an exorbitant amount of money, but I had wanted this trip to be flawless. I had specifically requested the master suite for myself, an expansive room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a soaking tub. I felt I had earned at least that much comfort. I entered the opulent lobby, dripping water onto the pristine marble floors, and made my way to the private elevator reserved for penthouse guests. As the elevator silently glided up to the top floor, a familiar knot of tension tightened in my stomach. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the usual barrage of microaggressions and backhanded compliments that always accompanied family reunions. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing a private, softly lit hallway leading exclusively to the penthouse entrance. I stepped out, pulling my suitcase behind me, and froze. There, sitting completely abandoned in the middle of the public hallway, was my second piece of designer luggage, the bag I had sent ahead with them in the rental SUV. It had not been brought inside the suite. It had been dumped unceremoniously outside the heavy oak door like a sack of garbage. I slowly walked up to the door and reached for the digital keypad. Before I could even enter the code, I heard the muffled sounds of loud, raucous laughter coming from inside. It was Chloe's high-pitched giggle, followed by the booming voice of her husband, Darren. I placed my hand on the handle and pushed the door open. The entryway was littered with their wet shoes and discarded jackets. I walked past the massive modern kitchen and looked down the long corridor leading to the bedrooms. The door to the master suite, the room I had specifically booked and paid for, was wide open. Through the doorway, I could see Chloe and Darren sprawled across the massive king-sized bed, their wet clothes tossed carelessly onto the silk duvet. Darren, a man who constantly bragged about his non-existent cryptocurrency investments while leeching off our parents, was holding a glass of the complimentary champagne I had pre-ordered. They had not only abandoned me in a storm, they had locked me out, dumped my belongings in the hall, and stolen my room. I stood there in the shadows of the hallway, the freezing rainwater dripping from my hair onto the expensive hardwood floor. I did not yell. I did not throw a fit. Instead, that same cold, calculated forensic instinct that made me lethal in the boardroom woke up inside me. The pressure cooker was officially sealed, and the heat was just getting started. Stepping out of the shadows of the hallway, I walked fully into the doorway of the master suite, letting my physical presence be known. The sheer audacity of the scene before me was almost cinematic. Chloe was lying flat on her stomach across the massive king-sized bed, her silk press perfectly intact and completely protected from the rain, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. Darren was leaning against the mahogany dresser, pouring himself another generous glass of the vintage champagne I had specifically pre-ordered for my own arrival. Neither of them looked remotely apologetic. Darren glanced up, catching my reflection in the massive vanity mirror. He did not jump. He did not look embarrassed. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne and offered a lazy, infuriatingly smug grin. "Look who finally made it," Darren drawled, swirling the golden liquid in his crystal flute. "We were starting to think you washed away in that storm, Nia." I looked from Darren to Chloe. My sister barely lifted her eyes from her glowing screen, completely indifferent to the fact that I was shivering and dripping rainwater onto the floor. "You are in my room," I said, my voice eerily flat. The reservation was made under my personal name, and this suite was selected and paid for by me. Chloe finally rolled over, sighing loudly, as if my standing there soaking wet was a personal inconvenience to her carefully curated day. "Oh, come on, Nia, do not start with the dramatic victim act right now." Darren has been incredibly stressed with his crypto portfolio all morning. The digital markets are super volatile right now, and he desperately needs a proper, spacious area to set up his multiple trading monitors. You know how crucial his investments are to our future wealth. You are single. You do not need a king-sized bed and a panoramic view of the lake all to yourself. I stared at Darren, a supposed crypto entrepreneur who had, to my expert forensic knowledge, never successfully closed a single profitable trade in his life. He spent his days watching YouTube videos about decentralized finance and his nights spending my parents' money. Yet he carried himself like a Silicon Valley titan. "There is a perfectly good smaller room near the laundry area," Darren added, waving his hand vaguely down the long carpeted hall. "The maid quarters, basically. It is quiet. You can crunch your little accounting numbers in there without us bothering you. Plus, Chloe needs the natural light in here for her social media content tomorrow." My wet clothes clung to my skin, sending a harsh chill straight through to my bones. The disrespect was so casual, so heavily practiced, that it was breathtaking. I could have thrown a massive fit. I could have pulled out my phone, canceled the entire reservation with one call to my concierge, and watched hotel security drag them out into the freezing rain. The impulse flared hot and bright in my chest, a sudden violent urge to burn the whole trip to the ground right then and there. But my professional instincts kicked in hard. A good forensic auditor never alerts the subject that they are under investigation. You observe. You document. You wait for the absolute perfect moment to drop the heavy hammer. Before I could say another word, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed down the marble hallway. My mother, Vivian, swept into the entryway. She was immaculately dressed in a tailored cream suit, her hair styled in stiff, perfect waves. She looked like she was stepping up to a podium at a megachurch leadership conference, not lounging in a vacation rental on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She stopped abruptly, looking me up and down with an expression of sheer, unadulterated distaste. "Look at you dripping all over the imported rugs," Vivian said, crossing her arms tightly. "I swear, Nia, you have no sense of decorum or spatial awareness. Go put a towel down before you ruin the security deposit." "Hello to you too, Mother," I replied softly. "The flight was bumpy, but I am so glad you all made it safely in the luxury SUV I rented." Vivian ignored the sarcasm entirely. She waved a perfectly manicured hand, dismissing my journey and my ruined luggage in one sweeping, arrogant motion. "We do not have time for your bad attitude today, Nia. Go dry off quickly and get straight into the kitchen. We have a massive amount of work to do, and you need to start prepping the marinades and the pastry dough. I am not playing games with you." I blinked momentarily, thrown off balance by her immediate demands. Prepping marinades, I asked. We are on vacation. I booked private dining reservations for us all week. Vivian stepped closer, her voice dropping into the authoritative, hushed tone she used when organizing church volunteers back in Atlanta. I canceled those reservations. We are hosting a highly important gathering tomorrow night instead. Bishop Davis from our Atlanta congregation flew into Chicago this morning with his wife. They are meeting with a delegation of elite Chicago pastors tomorrow, and they have graciously agreed to attend a VIP dinner with our family at Gibson's Italia. She paused purposefully, letting the heavy weight of the restaurant's name hang in the air. It was one of the most exclusive, astronomically expensive steakhouses in the entire city. After the dinner, Vivian continued, "We are bringing the delegation back here to the penthouse for dessert and fellowship. This is a crucial networking opportunity for your father's standing in the national church leadership. Everything must be absolutely flawless. I need you in the kitchen baking those specific fruit tartlets you do so well." I looked at her, the pure absurdity of the situation washing over me. You want me to spend my vacation cooking and serving desserts for your church friends, like the hired help? Vivian sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of her nose, as if dealing with a stubborn, ungrateful toddler. It is not just about serving Naya. It is about presenting the right image to the right people. Bishop Davis is actively looking for young, dynamic couples to spearhead the new National Youth Ministry initiative. Chloe and Darren are the absolute perfect candidates. They are vibrant. They are beautifully married, and Darren's entrepreneurial background makes him look incredibly successful to the older generation. They need to shine tomorrow night. They need to be the absolute face of the Williams family. And what exactly is my role in this perfect family portrait, I asked, my voice dropping barely above a whisper. Vivian looked me dead in the eye, utterly devoid of any maternal warmth. Her gaze was clinical and cutting. "You will stay in the background, Nia. You are 32, entirely unmarried, and you spend your life staring at spreadsheets. You do not exactly scream blessed and highly favored. I cannot have you sitting at that VIP table looking miserable and reminding everyone that my oldest daughter is a spinster. You will manage the catering behind the scenes. Chloe and Darren will entertain the pastors. Do you understand me?" The air in the penthouse seemed to grow heavy, thick with the toxic, unspoken rules of our family dynamic. Chloe and Darren were the glittering facade, the fake gold jewelry Vivian proudly flaunted to the world. I was the unglamorous machinery operating in the dark, expected to fund their lavish lifestyle and remain completely invisible. Darren chuckled loudly from the master bed, clearly enjoying the humiliating show. "Just listen to your mother, Nia. You are great at background work. Leave the high-level networking to the professionals." I stood there for a long time, the heavy silence stretching out, until the only sound was the fierce rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. My mother stared at me, waiting for the inevitable argument, waiting for me to raise my voice so she could call me bitter and jealous. She thrived on my emotional reactions. It fueled her perpetual victim complex. But I felt no urge to yell. The searing anger that had gripped me outside the airport suddenly vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute calm. The jagged pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Darren's sudden, desperate need for elite church networking. Vivian's absolute desperation to present a facade of massive wealth to the pastors. The way they had eagerly hijacked a trip funded entirely by my auditing firm. It was not just vanity, it was a cover-up. I could literally smell the financial desperation radiating off Darren's cheap cologne. I looked at my mother's immaculately tailored suit, then at Chloe scrolling mindlessly on her phone, and finally at Darren, who was finishing the very last drop of my champagne. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice incredibly smooth and pliant. "The image of the family is paramount. Bishop Davis should absolutely see Chloe and Darren for exactly who they are. I would not dream of getting in the way of their blessing tomorrow night." Vivian looked slightly taken aback by my easy capitulation, her perfectly arched eyebrows narrowing suspiciously. "Well, good. Just make sure the tartlets are ready by 8 tomorrow, and wipe up the wet floor on your way to the small bedroom." I nodded submissively. I bent down, picked up the handle of my soaking wet suitcase, and walked past the master's suite toward the cramped, windowless maid's quarters at the far back of the penthouse. As I closed the door to the tiny room, the darkness enveloped me. I did not turn on the light. I simply stood in the center of the cramped space, listening to the muffled sounds of Chloe and Darren laughing down the hall. I stripped off my wet jacket, letting it fall to the floor in a sodden heap. I reached into my bag and pulled out a fresh, dry apron. I slipped the strap over my head and tied the strings tightly around my waist, in a slow, methodical motion. They wanted me in the background. They wanted me out of sight. They wanted me to manage the numbers and the details while they stood in the spotlight. They had absolutely no idea what a massive, catastrophic mistake they had just made. By banishing me to the shadows, they had given me free rein to operate without scrutiny. A forensic accountant does not need a seat at the dinner table to destroy a financial empire. We just need quiet access to the ledger. I walked into the small attached bathroom and turned on the faucet. The water ran icy cold over my hands, a stark contrast to the boiling heat radiating in my chest. I scrubbed them diligently, watching the soapy water spiral down the drain, taking my last shred of familial loyalty with it. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were dark, unblinking, and entirely devoid of the vulnerable daughter who had boarded that plane in Atlanta. Tomorrow night at Gibson's Italia, they wanted a show. They wanted a public display of family perfection and spiritual elevation. I was going to give them a performance they would never, ever forget. I dried my hands, picked up my encrypted laptop from my bag, and prepared to dig into the digital dirt. The real work was about to begin. I walked out of the cramped maid's quarters and headed straight for the massive chef's kitchen. The marble countertops were already covered in half-empty bottles of sparkling water and discarded snack wrappers. I gathered my hair into a tight bun and began wiping down the surfaces. It was easier to play the obedient servant. It gave me the perfect cover. For the next hour, I marinated chicken, chopped vegetables, and mixed the pastry dough my mother demanded. My hands moved mechanically while my mind raced through every interaction, every sneer, every piece of entitlement my family had displayed since I arrived. My hands were coated in flour and oil. I wiped them on a towel and slipped into the adjoining half bath located just off the main living room. It was a small, elegant space lined with dark slate tiles. I turned on the gold faucet, letting the warm water wash over my skin. As I reached for the hand towel, a sudden sound caught my attention. The bathroom shared a thin ventilation vent directly with the main living area. The sleek metal grate sat high on the wall, and voices drifted through it with crystal-clear precision. I froze. The water stopped running. I held my breath, stepping closer to the vent. I recognized my father's deep, booming baritone immediately. Calvin had finally made it up from the parking garage. He was not asking where I was. He was not checking to see if his eldest daughter had survived the storm. He was strictly down to business. "Is the paperwork ready, Darren?" my father asked. His voice was low, stripped of the jovial, booming tone he used for his congregation. "Printed and completely legally binding." Darren replied, the smugness practically radiating through the air vent. "My lawyer looked it over twice. All she has to do is sign on the dotted line, and her auditing firm becomes the primary collateral for my new crypto hedge fund." I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My firm. The company I built with a decade of sweat, sleepless nights, and relentless grinding. Darren wanted to use my life's work as a financial shield for his imaginary digital currency gambling. "She is not going to just sign it, Darren." Chloe whined, her voice nasal and irritated. "You know how she is. Nia is obsessed with her money. She hoards it. She's going to ask a million questions." "That is exactly why we are doing this tomorrow night at Gibson's Italia," my mother interjected. Vivian's voice was sharp and commanding, cutting through Chloe's whining. "We are not giving her a chance to ask questions. We are backing her into a corner she cannot escape." I pressed my ear closer to the cold tile wall, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. "Bishop Davis and the Chicago elders will be sitting right across from us." Vivian continued laying out her master plan with the clinical precision of a military general. "Before the appetizers even arrive, I am going to stand up and initiate a special prayer of healing over Nia. a prayer for what Chloe asked, sounding genuinely confused. For her lonely, barren soul, Vivian snapped as if the answer were obvious. I am going to publicly weep for her. I will tell the pastors how she has lost her way, how she is consumed by corporate greed, how she is a spinster who refuses to submit to family values. I will lay hands on her and pray that God softens her hardened heart so she can finally share her blessings with the men who lead this family. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle the sharp gasp rising in my throat. My own mother was planning to weaponize her faith using the sacred space of a prayer to publicly humiliate me in front of powerful community leaders. She was going to brand me as a broken, spiritually lost woman just to shatter my defenses. And that is when I slide the business loan guarantee across the table, Darren said, his voice thick with eager greed. While the pastors are all looking at her nodding along with your prayer, I will tell them that Naya has graciously agreed to secure my new community wealth initiative. I will frame it as an investment in our people. She will not dare read the fine print in front of Bishop Davis. She will just sign it to avoid looking like a selfish, unchristian monster. And what if she refuses? Chloe asked. What if she actually says no right there at the table? My father's voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a sinister authority that made my skin crawl. If she says no, we play the final card. We look the bishop directly in the eye and tell him Nia has completely turned her back on her African-American heritage. We tell them she thinks she is too good for her own blood, that her white-collar success has made her arrogant and hateful toward her own community. We will make her look like a complete race traitor who hoards her wealth while her family struggles to uplift the neighborhood. Exactly, Vivian agreed, her tone dripping with satisfaction. We will play the devastated loving parents who lost their daughter to corporate greed. Bishop Davis will pity us. It will only increase our standing in the church, and Nia will be permanently disgraced. She cares too much about her professional reputation to risk a public scandal like that. She will sign the papers to keep the peace. She always bends when we apply enough pressure. The conversation shifted then. Darren started bragging about the luxury cars he planned to lease once my firm was legally bound to his debts. Chloe started listing designer boutiques on the magnificent mile she intended to visit with the impending loan money. They were already spending the wealth I had bled to build. I stood completely paralyzed in the half-bath. The sheer, breathtaking malice of their plan hit me with the force of a freight train. This was not just a case of family dysfunction. This was not just toxic entitlement. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated extortion plot. My parents were willing to completely assassinate my character, publicly humiliate me, and leverage my racial and spiritual identity just to fund Darren's delusions of grandeur. They viewed my life's work as a slush fund they were entitled to raid. They thought I was weak. They thought years of quiet obedience meant I lacked a spine. They assumed my desire for family harmony would override my basic instinct for self-preservation. They forgot one crucial detail. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my entire career dismantling corporate frauds, uncovering hidden assets, and destroying white-collar criminals who thought they were smarter than the paper trail. I destroyed arrogant men for a living. And Darren had just foolishly challenged me to a game of financial warfare. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy bathroom air fill my lungs. The hurt, the longing for a normal family, the desperate childhood wish for my mother's approval, all of it instantly vaporized. The lingering sadness of being abandoned at the airport burned away, leaving behind nothing but cold, hardened steel. They wanted to play games with legal documents and hidden agendas. They had no idea they had just invited a master chess player to the board. I smoothed the front of my apron. I adjusted my collar. I looked in the mirror one last time, making sure my face revealed absolutely nothing. I was ready. I stepped out of the adjoining bathroom, my face wiped completely clean of any lingering emotion. The trembling in my hands had vanished. The heavy, suffocating weight of being the unloved, disposable daughter was gone entirely, replaced by the cold, clinical, and lethal precision of a forensic accountant. The transition was absolute. My family had spent my entire life relying on my desire for their approval, using my loyalty as a weapon against me. But in that bathroom, listening to them plot to destroy my company and steal my future, the dutiful daughter officially died. Only the auditor remained. And an auditor does not feel. An auditor simply follows the money. I walked smoothly back into the massive kitchen, picking up a pristine white apron from the counter. I slipped it over my head, tying the strings tightly at my waist, and got to work. For the rest of the afternoon and straight into the evening, I played my assigned role to absolute perfection. I became a ghost in my own vacation rental. I silently marinated the chicken. I meticulously prepared the fruit tartlets my mother demanded. I served them drinks. I cleaned up their discarded room service trays. I moved through the penthouse completely unnoticed, listening, observing, and gathering behavioral data. Every time I walked past the living room, I studied Darren. A good forensic accountant knows that financial crimes are rarely committed by masterminds. They are committed by arrogant, sloppy people who believe they are the smartest individuals in the room. Darren fit the profile perfectly. He sat on the imported leather sofa, loudly bragging into his phone about decentralized finance and market capitalization, aggressively flashing a gold watch that looked just a little too shiny. He was overcompensating. Chloe sat next to him, taking endless selfies with the lake in the background, tagging her location to ensure her followers knew exactly how wealthy she supposedly was. My parents watched them with absolute adoration, completely blind to the hollow foundation supporting their golden children. I smiled politely whenever they barked an order at me, offering them the exact subservient obedience they expected. I just needed them to feel entirely safe. I needed them to drop their guard. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the penthouse finally went dead silent. The heavy rain continued to lash against the reinforced glass windows, masking any sound from within the suite. I sat alone in the cramped, windowless maid's quarters at the far back of the hallway. The room was practically a closet barely large enough to fit a twin bed, but right now it was my command center. I sat cross-legged on the narrow mattress and pulled my heavily encrypted work laptop from my leather tote bag. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh blue light. I cracked my knuckles open my network diagnostic tools and went hunting. Darren, in his sheer breathtaking arrogance, had made a fatal operational error. He had connected all of his personal devices to the penthouse's unsecured complimentary Wi-Fi network. He was not using a virtual private network. He was not running his traffic through an encrypted tunnel. He was conducting supposed high-level financial business on a public hotel network, leaving his digital front door wide open. For an expert in digital forensics, intercepting his network traffic was child's play. I launched a packet sniffer program, a specialized software designed to capture and log network traffic passing through the local router. Instantly, lines of code began cascading down my screen in a rapid, relentless waterfall. I isolated Darren's specific IP address and locked onto his digital footprint. I did not need his passwords. I just needed to see where his data was traveling. Numbers leave a permanent, undeniable trail, and Darren was tracking mud all over the internet. I started by digging into his highly publicized cryptocurrency firm. He had boasted about this company for years, claiming it was revolutionizing digital asset management. I pulled the corporate registration records from the Delaware Division of Corporations. The truth materialized on my screen within seconds. The firm was a hollow shell. It was registered to a generic virtual office address that housed 10,000 other empty LLCs. It had 0 listed employees other than Darren. It possessed 0 registered digital wallets, no trading volume, and absolutely no taxable revenue. The entire company was nothing but a poorly designed website and a fake logo. Darren was not a crypto entrepreneur. He was completely, unequivocally unemployed. I sat back, staring at the glowing screen. If the crypto firm was a complete fabrication, it immediately raised a massive red flag. How was Darren paying for Chloe's designer bags? How was he funding their luxury car leases? Where was the cash coming from to support their lavish influencer lifestyle in Atlanta? I dug deeper, analyzing the routing numbers and banking portals he was frequently connecting to through the hotel network. I traced the inbound wire transfers, hitting his primary checking account. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing basic security walls and pulling public banking ledgers associated with the source accounts. The digital trail led straight out of Chicago, winding all the way back down south. It led directly to Atlanta. I zoomed in on the specific originating routing number. The identification code hit my brain with the force of a physical blow. It was the primary banking institution used by my father's megachurch. I pulled up the church's semi-public financial disclosures, cross-referencing the account digits. The money was not coming from a general operational fund. It was bleeding directly out of the church's community, youth, and building fund. This was an exclusive high-balance account specifically designated for building a new community center in an underserved Atlanta neighborhood. It was the exact charitable project my father constantly bragged about overseeing. Calvin was the principal signatory on that specific account. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the wire logs, compiling a comprehensive spreadsheet of every single transaction that had traveled from the church's community fund into Darren's personal accounts over the last 18 months. I highlighted the columns, ran a quick summation algorithm, and waited for the final total to populate at the bottom of the screen. The number flashed in stark, undeniable green text: $150,000. Darren had embezzled exactly $150,000 from my father's church. He had siphoned the money in staggered, irregular wire transfers, disguising them as consulting fees and technological upgrades for the youth center. He had stolen from his own congregation, stealing funds meant for children to finance his fake baller lifestyle with my sister. I sat in the dark, the harsh light of the laptop reflecting in my eyes as the entire extortion plot suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. This was never about Darren needing a simple business loan to expand his crypto firm. This was a desperate, panicked cover-up. The megachurch was scheduled for its annual comprehensive independent financial audit at the end of the fiscal quarter. When the independent auditors arrived in Atlanta next month, they would immediately notice the massive, gaping hole in the community building fund. They would trace the missing $150,000 straight to Darren. My father, as the elder responsible for that account, would be destroyed. The scandal would ruin Calvin's reputation, strip Vivian of her social standing, and likely send Darren to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. They needed exactly $150,000 in untraceable clean cash to silently replace the stolen church funds before the auditors arrived, and they needed it immediately. That was why they hijacked my vacation. That was why Vivian was plotting to publicly humiliate me tomorrow night in front of the Chicago pastors. They needed to break my spirit, completely isolate me, and force me to sign that business loan guarantee at the dinner table. They intended to use my pristine, highly profitable auditing firm as collateral to secure a fast, massive bank loan. They were going to leverage my hard-earned company, saddle me with their massive debt, and use my money to cover up Darren's federal crime. If I refused, they would destroy my reputation, with the church elders effectively isolating me from our entire community back home. They were not just toxic, they were financial predators, and they had chosen me as their perfect, unsuspecting prey. I slowly closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the tiny maid's quarters. The darkness wrapped around me again, but I did not feel blind. I saw everything with absolute, terrifying clarity. My family looked at me and saw a weak, desperate woman who would gladly sacrifice her own company just to buy their temporary affection. They expected me to cower at Gibson's Italia tomorrow night. They expected me to sign away my life with tears in my eyes just to keep the peace. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face in the dark. I reached into my bag and pulled out a high-capacity encrypted silver USB drive. I plugged it into the side of my laptop, booted the system back up, and began meticulously downloading every single wire transfer log, every bank statement, and every piece of digital proof detailing the embezzlement. I compiled the files into a single, beautifully organized digital folder. I was not just going to refuse their loan tomorrow night. I was going to let them set the stage. I was going to let Vivian perform her little theatrical prayer. I was going to let Darren slide that fraudulent contract across the table. I was going to let them build their beautiful, towering house of cards in front of the most powerful religious leaders in the city. And then I was going to burn it to the ground. The glowing progress bar of the file transfer hit 100%. The silver USB drive chimed a soft, sharp completion tone in the quiet darkness of the cramped maid's quarters. I safely ejected the device and slipped it deep into the front pocket of my slacks. Most conventional auditors would have stopped right there. I had the primary motive. I had the undisputed crime. I had the exact, verified dollar amount of the embezzlement. It was more than enough financial ammunition to completely vaporize their extortion plot tomorrow night. But the pure electric adrenaline surging through my veins was far too potent to let me sleep. A true forensic accountant understands that identifying the stolen money is merely the opening act of the investigation. The real story, the absolute undeniable proof of a suspect's true character, always lies in exactly how that stolen money was spent. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp pops echoing in the small room, and opened a fresh encrypted spreadsheet on my laptop. I pulled up Darren's primary checking account, the specific account heavily padded with the stolen community youth funds. I began to meticulously categorize his outgoing wire transfers, his ATM withdrawals, and his massive credit card payments over the last 18 months. I expected to find reckless day trading losses. I fully expected to see thousands of dollars evaporating into volatile digital coins, failed algorithms, or ridiculous tech investments. That would have fit his loud, obnoxious persona as a self-proclaimed cryptocurrency king. Instead, the digital transaction ledger painted a wildly different, infinitely more pathetic picture. There was absolutely zero capital flowing into any investment portfolios. Darren was not a tragic failed investor, he was simply a prolific, highly enthusiastic spender. The first massive chunk of the stolen $150,000 went straight to a high-end exotic car dealership located in the heart of Buckhead. Darren had bypassed standard financing entirely. He had wired a staggering $40,000 in clean stolen church cash to secure aggressive short-term luxury leases. He had acquired two distinct vehicles. One was a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. The other was a pristine white Porsche Panamera. He was paying exorbitant monthly premiums just to maintain the absolute illusion of ownership. He was literally burning through a community building fund meant for impoverished youth just so he could look undeniably wealthy sitting in Atlanta traffic. But the luxury cars were merely the beginning of the financial hemorrhage. I dragged my cursor down the digital ledger, my eyes expertly scanning the endless, chaotic string of retail transactions. Darren was dropping $5,000 at a time at premium luxury boutiques. Phipps Plaza was functioning as his personal playground. The digital receipts showed massive, recurring purchases at Chanel, Christian Dior, and Hermes. He was buying limited edition handbags. He was purchasing diamond tennis bracelets. He was acquiring red-soled designer heels in multiple sizes. I paused, frowning deeply at the glowing screen. Chloe loved luxury, but my mother closely monitored her wardrobe with an eagle eye. If Chloe had suddenly acquired $80,000 worth of new, highly conspicuous designer accessories, Vivian would have noticed immediately. My mother would have bragged about those specific items endlessly to her church friends. Yet, Chloe had arrived in Chicago yesterday carrying a scuffed 2-year-old Prada tote bag. She was absolutely not the one receiving these extravagant retail gifts. I widened my search parameters, pulling Darren's comprehensive travel history from his linked American Express statements. A very distinct, highly frequent pattern rapidly emerged. Over the past 12 months, Darren had booked 7 different trips to Miami. These were not budget weekend getaways or cheap business layovers. He was booking first-class, direct flights from Atlanta to Miami International. He was reserving panoramic ocean view suites at the most exclusive, astronomically expensive luxury resorts in South Beach. He was dropping $2,000 a night on room service poolside cabanas and VIP nightclub tables. I opened a secondary browser window and cross-referenced the exact dates of these Miami excursions with my family's public social media history. During every single one of those long, extravagant weekends, Chloe had posted pictures of herself back at their house in Atlanta. She had complained online about how incredibly hard her husband was working on his out-of-state tech conferences. She had posted sad face emojis about missing him. Darren was not attending tech conferences. He was sipping ridiculously expensive champagne on a private balcony overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and he was definitely not doing it alone. The hotel itemized receipts showed consistent charges for dual spa packages. The restaurant tabs consistently reflected meals and drinks for two people. My fingers flew across the keyboard, moving with absolute ruthless efficiency. I bypassed standard security protocols and hacked directly into the airline's digital manifest database using Darren's saved frequent flyer login credentials. I needed to see the secondary name attached to those first-class boarding passes. I needed to know exactly who was helping Darren burn through the church's Sacred Youth Center funds. I pulled up the passenger manifest for his most recent trip to Miami, which had occurred barely 3 weeks ago. The booking was clearly listed for 2 adult passengers. Passenger 1 was Darren Vance. I slowly scrolled my cursor to the right, landing heavily on the name of his travel companion. My breath completely hitched in my throat. I blinked rapidly, rubbing my tired eyes, certain the harsh blue light of the screen was playing tricks on my exhausted brain. I read the name a second time, then a third. It remained unchanged. Passenger 2 was Tiffany Hayes. Tiffany. The name echoed in the tiny, cramped room like a physical gunshot. Tiffany was not a random mistress. She was not a stranger Darren had picked up at an upscale Buckhead bar. Tiffany Hayes was Chloe's childhood best friend. They had shared absolute secrets since the 7th grade. They had gone to their high school prom together. They had pledged the exact same exclusive sorority in college. Tiffany was the very woman who had stood directly next to Chloe at the altar. She had held my sister's floral bouquet as the maid of honor, while Darren slipped a diamond wedding ring onto Chloe's finger. Tiffany was practically considered a second daughter to my mother. She attended our intimate family Thanksgiving dinners. She sat in the front row of my father's massive church every single Sunday morning, nodding along and listening to Calvin preach loudly about family loyalty, moral integrity, and divine salvation. And for the last 18 months, she had been living a lavish, secret double life on the sun-drenched beaches of Miami, funded entirely by money stolen directly from that very same church. The absolute profound sickness of the entire situation washed over me, leaving me momentarily paralyzed in the dark. Darren was not merely an arrogant thief attempting to save his own skin from a financial audit. He was a spectacular, remorseless sociopath. He was actively destroying his marriage. He was betraying my sister with her closest, most trusted confidant. He was financing their illicit romance, using money strictly designated to build a safe haven for vulnerable youth. He had bought Tiffany the Chanel bags. He had bought Tiffany the diamond bracelets. He was driving Tiffany around Atlanta in a leased matte black G-Wagon, while my sister sat alone at home blindly believing her husband was a hard-working corporate visionary. And now, because the walls were finally closing in, because the independent church auditors were weeks away from uncovering his massive, undeniable fraud, Darren had panicked. His solution was not to confess his sins. His solution was to drag his entire family to Chicago under the false guise of a networking vacation. His plan was to orchestrate a vicious psychological attack against me, utilizing my mother's cruel manipulation tactics, and force me to sign away my professional livelihood to restitute his theft. He wanted me to unknowingly pay for the first-class flights to Miami. He wanted me to fund the diamond bracelets he bought for his wife's best friend. He fully expected my decade of grueling hard work to quietly subsidize his treachery. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the betrayal was so staggering it transcended normal anger. It moved rapidly past standard fury and settled into a place of absolute crystalline clarity. I closed the airline manifest window and systematically downloaded every single flight record, every detailed hotel invoice, and every digital receipt outlining his luxury purchases for Tiffany. I saved them all into a new, highly encrypted folder on my silver USB drive. I named the digital file simply Gibson's Italia. My family thought they had devised the perfect, inescapable trap. They thought they possessed the ultimate emotional and spiritual leverage. They truly believed they could break me with a theatrical public prayer and a sinister threat to my cultural and familial identity. They were about to learn a very painful, irreversible lesson about the fundamental nature of leverage. Leverage only works when the person you are threatening actually has something left to lose. I had already lost my family a long time ago. I had absolutely no sentimental attachments left for them to sever. I was entirely free. I shut down my laptop and carefully packed it away into my tote bag. I stood up in the dark, cramped room and stretched my stiff muscles. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, silent stillness over the towering city of Chicago. Dawn was still a few hours away. Tomorrow night, we would sit down at a beautifully set table overlooking the river. The elite Chicago pastors would be dressed in their finest tailored suits. Vivian would be perfectly coiffed, ready to perform her weeping, manipulative monologue. Calvin would sit at the head of the long table, projecting an aura of divine, untouchable authority. Darren would have his fraudulent loan contract tucked neatly inside his expensive jacket pocket, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were eagerly expecting a slaughter. They were absolutely right to expect one. They just had the wrong victim in mind. I smiled, feeling a genuine, dangerous thrill course hotly through my veins. The forensic accountant was fully awake, and I was going to serve them a dinner they would never ever survive. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The initial rush of uncovering Darren's sordid double life with Tiffany was beginning to fade, settling into the cold, calculating mindset of a seasoned auditor. I had the who, the what, and the where. I had the exact dollar amounts and the digital receipts. But a true forensic investigation requires a complete balance sheet. There was still a glaring gap in the narrative. If Darren had stolen the money over the last 18 months and the audit was approaching, why the sudden desperate ambush this week? Why involve my auditing firm as collateral? If they just needed cash to replace the church funds, Calvin and Vivian could have taken out a standard personal loan. They had perfect credit, they had zero debt. Wait, did they still have zero debt? I opened a new browser tab. I bypassed the corporate databases and logged directly into the Fulton County Public Property Records portal in Georgia. I typed in the address of my childhood home, the massive, beautiful brick colonial sitting on a manicured acre in South Atlanta. That house was not just a piece of real estate. It was the absolute crown jewel of our family. It was our anchor. My late grandfather had purchased that property outright decades ago. He was a proud, fiercely hardworking man who had spent 40 years grinding out double shifts at a local auto plant. He had endured systemic racism, terrible wages, and exhausted bones just to ensure his descendants would never know the terror of a landlord's knock. He paid off the mortgage completely before he died. He handed the clear deed to my mother as a sacred shield. It was our generational wealth. It was the ultimate safety net. It meant that no matter what happened in the world, the Williams family owned the roof over their heads, free and clear. I hit the search key. The property history populated on my screen. I clicked on the most recent lien filings. The document rendered in stark black and white text. My stomach dropped violently. A wave of pure physical nausea hit me so hard I actually had to grip the edge of the mattress to steady myself. 3 months ago, Calvin and Vivian Williams had quietly taken out a massive high-interest second mortgage against the fully paid-off estate. They had leveraged the entire value of the property. The total loan amount was exactly $200,000. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening crunch. The timeline aligned perfectly. My parents had not just discovered Darren's embezzlement this week. They had found out 3 months ago. They had realized that their golden son-in-law had siphoned $150,000 from Calvin's Sacred Church Community Fund to buy Chanel bags and Miami hotel suites for his mistress. They knew he was a thief. They knew he was a fraud. But instead of holding him accountable, instead of throwing him to the wolves and letting him face the federal consequences of his felony, they chose to protect him. They chose to protect the glittering, flawless image of their perfect family. Calvin could not stomach the humiliation of stepping down from his exalted position as a church elder. Vivian could not bear the social disgrace of her friends finding out her perfect daughter was married to a broke, cheating criminal. So they sacrificed my grandfather's legacy. They mortgaged the family's only true debt-free asset to secure a massive pile of cash. They quietly replaced the missing church funds themselves, covering Darren's tracks before the upcoming audit. But high-risk emergency second mortgages carry astronomically high, predatory interest rates. They had taken on a crushing monthly payment they could not afford on a pastor's salary. They were drowning. The bank was likely already preparing to issue default notices. They were weeks away from losing the generational home my grandfather had bled to secure. That was the true reason for this Chicago trip. Darren's fake crypto firm was just the convenient smokescreen. They needed my successful auditing company. They needed my pristine corporate credit, my flawless balance sheet, and my verified revenue streams to secure a massive commercial consolidation loan. They were planning to leverage my life's work to bail themselves out of the catastrophic debt they had incurred to protect a lying, cheating embezzler. I clamped a hand over my mouth, fighting the urgent need to vomit. I stumbled into the tiny attached bathroom and turned on the cold water, splashing it against my face. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, staring at my pale reflection in the harsh vanity light. A vivid, infuriating memory suddenly surged to the front of my mind. I was 22 years old, standing in the foyer of that exact Atlanta house. I had just been accepted into a prestigious, highly rigorous CPA certification program. I was terrified, but deeply proud. I had asked my mother to co-sign a modest $5,000 student loan to cover my examination fees and study materials. Vivian had stood on the hardwood floor my grandfather had paid for and looked at me with absolute chilling disdain. She refused to sign. She delivered a blistering 30-minute lecture about financial discipline and the sacred duty of protecting our family's assets. "Generational wealth is our armor, Nia," she had scolded, her voice echoing in the grand foyer. "We do not squander what our ancestors bled for. Debt is a disease. If you cannot afford your little accounting classes, you need to work harder. We do not risk the family foundation for personal vanity." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of it made me physically dizzy. She had denied me a $5,000 educational loan because debt was a disease. Yet she had secretly signed away a $1 million debt-free estate to cover up a felony committed by a man who was actively funding a double life with her daughter's best friend. She had risked the family foundation not for survival, but for the absolute toxic vanity of maintaining a fake public image. They were willing to let me assume the crushing weight of their financial sins while publicly branding me a spiritually lost spinster. They were perfectly happy to drain my company dry, risk my professional license, and let me take the fall if the commercial loan defaulted. I was the designated beast of burden, expected to pull the plow until I collapsed in the dirt, all while they rode comfortably in the carriage. I grabbed a towel and dried my face. The nausea completely vanished, replaced by an Arctic absolute calm. The shock was over. The grief of betrayal was entirely gone. I was no longer a daughter reeling from the discovery of her family's treachery. I was a professional executioner preparing her brief. I walked back to the narrow bed and sat down with perfect, rigid posture. I opened my encrypted laptop one final time. I created a master directory on my desktop. I worked with the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon operating on a terminal patient. I pulled the official stamped property deed from the Fulton County portal, highlighting the secondary lien and the fresh mortgage signatures belonging to Calvin and Vivian Williams. I dropped it into the folder. I pulled the digital wire transfer logs from the church's Community Youth and Building Fund, highlighting the exact dates and amounts siphoned directly into Darren's personal checking accounts. I dropped it into the folder. I pulled the American Express credit card statements highlighting the exorbitant charges at Chanel Dior and the luxury car dealership in Buckhead. I dropped it into the folder. Finally, I pulled the absolute kill shot: the first-class airline manifests, the luxury hotel booking confirmations in South Beach, the dual spa receipts, every single piece of undeniable digital evidence linking Darren's stolen wealth directly to Tiffany Hayes. I dropped it all into the folder. I reviewed the contents of the directory. It was a flawless, airtight, completely unassailable forensic portfolio. It was the financial autopsy of a family built on lies, theft, and devastating betrayal. There was no room for denial. There was no room for Vivian's gaslighting. There was no room for Calvin's booming authoritative deflections. The numbers were absolute. The paper trail was permanent. I plugged my silver high-capacity USB drive into the port. I initiated the file transfer, watching the progress bar steadily fill with green. I was downloading the complete destruction of the Williams family facade. The transfer completed with a soft chime. I ejected the drive and held the cool metal in the palm of my hand. This tiny piece of hardware was no longer just a storage device. It was a forged, fully loaded weapon. It held the power to shatter Darren's life, destroy Tiffany's reputation, expose Calvin's complicity, and strip Vivian of every ounce of pride and social standing she possessed. I slipped the silver drive into the hidden interior pocket of my black blazer, the jacket I planned to wear to the VIP dinner. I closed the laptop, slid it back into my leather tote, and zipped the bag shut. I looked at the digital clock on my phone. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the heavy storm clouds over Lake Michigan. The rain had ceased, leaving the city washed clean and eerily silent. In a few hours, the penthouse would wake up. Chloe would start demanding room service. Darren would start pacing nervously, rehearsing his fraudulent business pitch. Vivian would start barking orders, demanding I iron her dress and prepare to remain invisible. They would continue to treat me like an ignorant, subservient pawn, completely unaware that I had already won the game. I lay down on the narrow, uncomfortable twin mattress and closed my eyes. I did not feel stressed. I did not feel anxious about the impending confrontation. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. The truth is a powerful, liberating force, and I was about to serve it on a silver platter at the most exclusive steakhouse in Chicago. I let the rhythm of my own steady heartbeat lull me to sleep. I needed to be perfectly rested. The real performance was only hours away. I woke exactly at 6. No alarm was necessary. My internal clock had spent 30 years perfectly synchronized to the relentless demands of the Williams family. I rose from the narrow, rigid twin bed, meticulously smoothed the cheap cotton sheets, and stepped out into the sprawling, silent penthouse. The morning sun was just beginning to pierce the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp, blinding shadows across the imported hardwood floors. I tied my pristine white apron around my waist, pulled my hair into a severe, highly practical knot at the nape of my neck, and began my assigned duties. I prepared a flawless breakfast spread. I whisked thick batter for brioche French toast, fried thick-cut applewood bacon until it was perfectly crisp, sliced exotic fruit platters with surgical precision, and poured a heavy crystal carafe of freshly squeezed orange juice. I brewed the dark Ethiopian coffee exactly the way Calvin demanded, strong enough to strip paint from the walls, and steeped Vivian's delicate imported chamomile tea at the precise temperature she required. I moved through the gleaming, state-of-the-art kitchen like a phantom, making absolutely zero noise. The forensic auditor inside me had retreated, securely locked behind the impenetrable, subservient mask of the dutiful daughter. I was the perfect invisible servant they fully expected me to be. At 8 o'clock, the golden couple finally emerged. Chloe drifted into the kitchen first, moving with the lazy, entitled grace of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. She was wearing a set of matching silk pajamas that probably cost more than my first vehicle. She poured herself a massive mimosa, completely bypassing the elaborate breakfast I had spent 2 hours preparing. As she reached up to grab a crystal flute from the cabinet, the overhead recessed lights caught the distinctive luminous sheen on her high cheekbones. The scent hit my nose a second later. It was an unmistakable blend of rare, cold-pressed botanical oils mixed with a faint hint of crushed rose petals. It was my La Mer Restorative Moisturizer. It was a highly specific, extraordinarily expensive jar of cream that I had packed deep inside the zippered compartment of my personal toiletry bag. This meant my sister had blatantly rummaged through my private luggage while I was busy cooking her breakfast. She had stolen a $500 cosmetic product without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. I watched her casually sip her champagne and orange juice, her skin glowing radiantly with my stolen property. The old Nia would have felt a sharp, familiar sting of intense violation. The old Nia would have internalized the blatant disrespect, twisting herself into mental knots to excuse the behavior, convincing herself it was just typical sisters sharing things. The new Nia, the forensic auditor, holding a heavily encrypted silver USB drive in her pocket, simply cataloged the theft. Chloe taking my moisturizer was identical in nature to Darren taking the church funds. They were both parasites. They were structurally incapable of generating their own value or earning their own keep, so they were forced to constantly siphon off anyone close to them. I smiled politely, offering her a silver platter of fresh berries. She waved it away without even making eye contact. I felt absolutely nothing. An hour later, Vivian made her grand entrance. She swept into the kitchen fully dressed for the day, her posture rigidly upright and her sharp eyes instantly scanning the room for imperfections. She found nothing wrong with the breakfast layout, so she immediately turned her highly critical gaze directly onto me. I had changed out of my apron and slipped into the exact outfit I intended to wear to Gibson's Italia tonight. It was a tailored, charcoal gray suit jacket paired with a crisp, high-collared white blouse and fitted trousers. It was armor. It was the standard uniform of a woman who commanded respect in corporate boardrooms across the country. It was clean, professional, and entirely appropriate for a high-end steakhouse dinner. Vivian circled me slowly, moving like a shark evaluating a wounded seal. Her lips pursed in deep, visible disapproval. She reached out and adjusted my lapel with sharp, aggressive tugs that bordered on physical strikes. "It is far too corporate, Nia," she declared, her voice dripping with artificial cloying concern. "You look like you are going to sit through a legal deposition, not a high society dinner. You need to soften up. You are entirely too harsh. The men attending this dinner are powerful, influential leaders of our church community. Men of that caliber do not want to look across the table and see a woman dressed like a bank manager. You intimidate them with all this rigid masculine structure." She stepped back, raking her eyes up and down my body with blatant disgust. "That is exactly why you are still single," she added, delivering the familiar insult with surgical precision. "Put on a dress. Find something pastel, something floral. You need to look approachable and agreeable tonight. We are conducting crucial family business, and I will not have you sitting there looking like a hostile witness." She wanted me soft. She wanted me draped in a delicate, fragile pastel dress, so I would look appropriately weak and malleable when they finally handed me the fraudulent commercial loan documents. She wanted me to look exactly like a submissive, obedient victim in front of the elite Chicago pastors. She needed the visual optics to match their extortion plot. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I stared past her flawless makeup and her expensive jewelry. I saw the absolute terrifying void where maternal warmth and unconditional love should have been. She was meticulously grooming a lamb for the slaughterhouse, ensuring the wool was clean before the blade came down. A slow, entirely hollow smile spread across my face. The muscles in my cheeks worked perfectly, projecting total, unquestioning compliance. I mirrored her energy flawlessly, dialing up my submissive tone. "You are completely right, Mother," I said smoothly, letting my voice drop into a soft, agreeable register. "I will find something much softer to wear for tonight." I definitely would not want to intimidate anyone at the table. She beamed brightly, deeply satisfied with my immediate surrender, and glided gracefully toward the dining table to drink her imported tea. I turned back to the massive marble island to begin clearing the remaining breakfast plates. That is when Darren made his move. He cornered me seamlessly, trapping me in the narrow space between the heavy mahogany counter and the towering stainless steel refrigerator. He leaned his hip against the marble, completely blocking my exit path, and slung a heavy, familiar arm around my shoulders. It was a physical gesture specifically meant to project warm, brotherly affection, but it felt like a lead weight pressing down on my spine. He smelled heavily of aggressive designer cologne and sheer, unadulterated desperation. He flashed that brilliant, completely empty smile that had charmed his way into our family and fooled an entire congregation. "Nia," he started, his voice dropping into a fake conspiratorial whisper meant just for the two of us. "Tonight is going to be absolutely huge for us. For the whole family. You know I have always looked out for you, right? I have always told Chloe how incredibly smart you are, how capable you are. You are the real brains of the operation in this family." He squeezed my shoulder, tightening his grip just a fraction to ensure I was paying close attention to his pitch. I have a massive game-changing opportunity on the table tonight. He continued, his tone dripping with manufactured vulnerability and fake humility. But I need someone I trust by my side. Someone who truly understands high-level corporate business and complex financial structures. Calvin and Vivian believe in my vision, but I need my brilliant sister-in-law in my corner when I pitch this to the investors. We are going to build an empire, Nia. A total digital dynasty. I just need you to keep an open mind at dinner. Can you do that for me? Can you have my back when the stakes are high? He was laying the emotional trap with sickening precision. He was establishing the psychological groundwork, feeding my supposed lifelong desperation for family validation. He was pretending to finally recognize my intellect and business acumen just hours before he planned to completely hijack my auditing firm. He was playing the role of the visionary struggling tech entrepreneur, completely unaware that I had spent the entire night downloading his Miami hotel receipts and Tiffany Hayes's first-class flight records. He was asking for my blessing while actively bankrupting my parents and defrauding my father's church. I looked up at him. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of desperate, eager gratitude onto my face. I let my shoulders slump forward, feigning the exact emotional vulnerability he was hunting for. I leaned slightly into his heavy arm, playing the part of the lonely sister, finally being welcomed into the inner circle. "Of course, Darren," I whispered softly, projecting pure, blind loyalty. "You know I will always do whatever is best for this family. You can absolutely count on me tonight." Darren grinned widely, his eyes flashing with a dark, predatory triumph. He had secured his mark. He patted my shoulder twice, released his grip, and swaggered out of the kitchen to join Chloe in the living room, loudly bragging about blockchain algorithms. I stood alone in the pristine kitchen, listening to their muffled laughter echoing down the hallway. I picked up a damp microfiber cloth and meticulously wiped down the marble counter where he had been leaning, pressing hard to wipe away the greasy residue of his presence. I had played the subservient daughter flawlessly. I had played the grateful, desperate sister to perfection. The mourning mask was firmly in place, secured with titanium bolts. The extortion trap was set, but they were the ones standing directly on the tripwire. The morning dissolved into a sluggish, heavy afternoon. I sat at the glass desk in the small office alcove off the main living area, projecting the image of a bored professional reviewing mundane tax updates on a tablet. Darren sauntered in, pulling the heavy French doors shut behind him with a soft, deliberate click that instantly signaled his true intentions. The loud, overbearing swagger he projected flawlessly for my parents had vanished. In its place was a carefully manufactured expression of sheepish, relatable embarrassment. He dragged a leather chair across the Persian rug, positioning it uncomfortably close to my side of the desk. He leaned in, resting his elbows on his knees, cultivating the air of a man bringing a trusted confidant into his inner circle. He aggressively rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling a heavy, performative sigh. "Nia, I need a massive favor." He began, dropping his voice to a low, urgent hum to ensure the sound did not travel through the glass doors. "And I really need you to keep this entirely between us. Do not tell Chloe. Do not mention a word to Calvin or Vivian." I locked my tablet screen and gave him my full, wide-eyed attention, perfectly playing the role of the concerned, deeply honored sister. "Of course, Darren. What is going on? Are you okay?" He ran a hand over his perfectly sculpted beard, shaking his head as if frustrated by his own immense success. "I am in a bit of a temporary liquidity crunch. I initiated a massive cryptocurrency transfer late yesterday. We are talking high six figures. I am moving substantial digital assets between cold wallets to prepare the necessary capital for the commercial expansion we are discussing tonight. But the blockchain validation protocol automatically flagged the transaction size. It is a standard automated security measure. It temporarily froze my linked debit and credit accounts until the transfer officially clears the central exchange node. It was a phenomenal, technically dense lie. It was a beautiful mosaic of buzzwords designed to utterly intimidate anyone who did not intimately understand decentralized finance. It was also pure, unadulterated garbage. He was experiencing a liquidity crunch because he had completely drained the stolen community youth funds on first-class flights to South Beach and diamond tennis bracelets for his wife's maid of honor. That sounds incredibly stressful, I said, injecting a precise dose of empathetic worry into my tone. It is just highly annoying, he countered instantly, his fragile ego flaring up to protect his image. The accounts will automatically unfreeze by tomorrow morning. It is a routine delay, but I want to take Chloe shopping this afternoon on the Magnificent Mile. I promised her a new handbag for being so incredibly supportive of this venture. I need a quick temporary loan. Just $2,000 in cash to bridge the gap until tomorrow. I will wire you the money back the second my accounts clear the security protocol. He was systematically testing the waters. He was priming the pump for the massive catastrophic corporate loan extortion they had planned for later tonight. If I handed over $2,000 in cash without asking a single verifying question, I was cementing my status as the compliant, easily manipulated bank they believed me to be. I allowed a brief, perfectly timed flicker of hesitation to cross my features, just enough to make him sweat for a fraction of a second, before replacing it with a warm, endlessly accommodating smile. Darren, you are family. You do not even need to ask. Let me grab my emergency cash stash from the safe. His broad shoulders dropped an entire inch as profound relief washed over him. I stood up and walked down the long carpeted hallway to the master suite I had been forced to vacate. I slipped silently into the expansive walk-in closet, knelt on the plush floor, and keyed the numerical combination into my portable biometric safe. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside sat neatly banded stacks of $100 bills. I never traveled without emergency liquid capital. He had asked for $2,000. I pulled out 30 fresh sequential $100 bills. $3,000. Greed is a highly predictable, incredibly potent narcotic. When you offer a desperate predator significantly more than they requested, their critical thinking skills instantly evaporate. The unexpected windfall completely blinds them to the mechanics of the trap. I closed the heavy safe and pulled a crisp ivory sheet of heavyweight corporate stationery from my leather folio, along with my favorite black ink fountain pen. I needed a receipt to justify the cash exchange. But infinitely more important than that, I needed a signed confession. I sat at the small vanity desk and began to write. To the untrained, arrogant eye, the document looked like a standard, overly formal IOU between family members. But I was not drafting a casual receipt. I was forging a lethal, legally binding contract utilizing highly specific, heavily regulated financial terminology. I wrote that the cash was being advanced to Darren Vance, acting specifically in his capacity as a financial broker. I explicitly noted that these cash funds were to be commingled with his existing Atlanta-based community investment portfolios. I wove in the exact unforgiving legal statutes that legally define an unregistered securities broker handling third-party capital. I carefully embedded language acknowledging his direct autonomous control and transfer of specified community-building assets. By signing this single sheet of thick ivory paper, Darren was legally admitting to functioning as an unlicensed financial broker in the state of Georgia. He was permanently putting his signature on a document that directly linked his personal cash flow to the exact classification of Atlanta community funds he had just embezzled from my father's megachurch. When the independent auditors inevitably arrived in Atlanta next month and uncovered the missing $150,000, this seemingly innocent piece of stationery would serve as a concrete, irrefutable signed confession. It completely destroyed any future legal defense he might attempt regarding accidental fund commingling or innocent banking errors. I blew softly on the wet ink, ensuring the sharp black lines were perfectly dry. It was a masterpiece of corporate espionage, seamlessly disguised as a sisterly favor. I walked back into the office alcove holding the thick stack of hundreds and the folded stationery. Darren stood up immediately, his eyes locked onto the green band of cash like a laser. He looked exactly like a starving dog staring at raw meat. I held the money out, but I did not let him take it. I pulled 3,000, I said softly, watching his pupils physically dilate at the increased number. Chicago is expensive, and I want you and Chloe to have an amazing afternoon. Do not even worry about paying me back until next week, when everything is fully settled." "Nia, you are incredible," he breathed, his hand twitching as he reached out. "Seriously, you are an absolute lifesaver." I smoothly pulled the cash back an inch and extended the fountain pen and the unfolded stationery with my other hand. "I just need you to sign this quickly. It is strictly for my own bookkeeping. You know how ridiculously pedantic I am about tracking my liquid cash withdrawals. Professional hazard of being an auditor." I delivered the lie with a light, self-deprecating laugh, framing my request as a silly, neurotic accounting habit. I handed him the paper and the pen. Darren took the pen. He did not read a single line of the carefully crafted text. His eyes never left the $3,000 resting in my left hand. His towering ego and his overwhelming desperate greed completely eradicated any basic sense of self-preservation. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room, effortlessly manipulating his sad, desperate sister-in-law out of her disposable spending money. He flattened the heavy ivory paper against the glass desk and hastily scribbled his signature at the bottom, eager to complete the transaction and secure his prize. He handed the signed document back to me. I handed him the cash. "You are the absolute best, Nia," he said aggressively, shoving the thick stack of bills deep into his front pocket. "Tonight is going to be legendary. Just wait." "I am counting on it," I replied, folding the signed contract and sliding it smoothly into my pocket. Darren turned on his heel and strode out of the office, his posture instantly transforming back into the arrogant, untouchable tech mogul ready to conquer the city. I stood completely still in the quiet room, my fingertips tracing the raised texture of his signature through the fabric of my trousers. Looking at the heavy, sweeping strokes of his handwriting had triggered a visceral, deeply buried memory. 5 years ago, I had stared at a very similar, arrogant signature on a joint bank account withdrawal slip. It was my ex-husband's signature. He had been a charming, devastatingly handsome man who spoke beautifully about our shared future while systematically draining our combined life savings to finance a hidden parallel life with a woman he met at his gym. When I finally uncovered his profound financial betrayal, I filed for divorce immediately. I severed the tie with surgical, unapologetic efficiency. I remembered walking into my parents' Atlanta home a week later. I was expecting a sanctuary. I was expecting the fierce, unconditional protection of my mother. Instead, Vivian had sat in her high-backed velvet chair and looked at me with cold, unforgiving eyes. She did not condemn the man who had robbed me blind and shattered our vows. She condemned me. "You failed as a wife, Nia," she had stated, her voice as hard and sharp as flint. "A smart woman manages her household. A smart woman keeps her husband satisfied so his eyes do not wander to someone else. A smart woman properly secures her assets. You let him humiliate you, and now by failing to keep your marriage together, you have humiliated this family." She had blamed me for being stolen from. She had weaponized my total devastation to reinforce her own self-righteous superiority. I had walked out of her house that afternoon, climbed into my car, and sat there for 3 hours staring blindly at the steering wheel. I did not cry. I did not scream. I made a quiet, unbreakable vow in the absolute suffocating silence of my vehicle. I swore that I would become an impenetrable fortress. I swore that I would master the intricate mechanics of every financial system, every legal loophole, and every corporate trap. I promised myself that no one, absolutely no one, would ever steal from me again and walk away breathing. Darren had just taken $3,000 of my hard-earned money. But unlike my ex-husband, Darren had not escaped. He had just eagerly handed me the very rope I would use to hang him. The commercial loan pitch was scheduled for 7 o'clock tonight at Gibson's Italia. My family was arriving with empty hands, expecting me to willingly hand over the keys to my kingdom. They had absolutely no idea I was bringing a guillotine. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the atmospheric pressure inside the penthouse shifted dramatically. The lazy, entitled lethargy of the morning completely evaporated, replaced by a frantic, high-stakes frenzy of superficial vanity. Through the thin walls of my cramped guest room, I could hear the symphony of the Williams family preparing to hold court. The sharp hiss of a garment steamer working overtime on silk, the aggressive rhythmic shaking of expensive aerosol hairsprays. Calvin's booming baritone echoing down the corridor as he vigorously practiced his pastoral anecdotes, testing the resonance of his own voice against the imported marble. They were meticulously armoring themselves in designer labels and artificial confidence, preparing for a dinner where they fully intended to execute a hostile takeover of my life's work. I stood in the center of the tiny, poorly lit guest quarters and began to pack. I moved with the clinical, unfeeling efficiency of a crime scene cleaner erasing all evidence of their presence. I retrieved my hard-shell rolling luggage from the closet and laid it flat on the rigid twin mattress. I folded my casual clothes with sharp, perfect creases. I packed away my running shoes, my sleepwear, and my personal electronics. I left absolutely nothing behind. I stripped the room of my energy, my scent, and my physical footprint. I was a ghost preparing to vanish. I checked my reflection in the narrow mirror mounted on the closet door. I wore the charcoal gray corporate suit Vivian had so viciously criticized that morning. The tailored fabric hung perfectly against my frame. The crisp white blouse was buttoned high, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. I reached into the hidden interior pocket of the blazer. My fingers brushed the cool, rigid edge of the encrypted silver USB drive. I reached into the opposite pocket and felt the sharp folded crease of the heavy ivory corporate stationery bearing Darren's fresh, legally binding signature. My weapons were fully secured. The armory was locked. Before zipping my luggage closed, I reached deep into the secondary compartment and carefully extracted the final piece of psychological artillery I had brought for this exact occasion. It was a pristine, bright red Hermes shopping bag. It was a rare limited edition holiday release crafted from impossibly thick textured paper and finished with the brand's iconic heavy woven handles. The sheer vibrant intensity of the red color commanded immediate visual attention. It was a beacon of absolute undeniable wealth. I carried the bag out of the guest room and walked silently down the long carpeted hallway toward the master suite. The massive double mahogany doors were left wide open, a blatant display of Chloe and Darren's territorial dominance. The suite was a disaster zone of discarded garments, spilled cosmetics, and tangled charging cables. I stepped over a discarded pair of suede loafers and walked directly to the massive king-sized bed that they had stolen from me the moment we arrived. I placed the bright red Hermes shopping bag right in the dead center of the mattress. I adjusted the thick woven handles so they stood perfectly upright. I smoothed a microscopic wrinkle from the side of the bag, ensuring it caught the warm glow of the bedside lamps. It was an exquisite, flawlessly executed psychological trap. I understood the mechanics of Vivian and Chloe's minds better than they understood themselves. They were utterly consumed by status symbols. They worshipped luxury brands with a religious, frantic devotion. When they walked into this room and saw that bright red bag sitting on the bed, their brains would instantly short-circuit. They would not suspect a trap. Their towering, blinding arrogance would immediately lead them to the conclusion that I had purchased an exorbitant peace offering. They would assume I was desperately trying to buy my way back into their good graces. They would believe with absolute certainty that I was begging to be included in Darren's fraudulent business venture. The sight of that bright red bag would pump a lethal dose of overconfidence directly into their veins. It would validate every toxic assumption they held about my subservience. They would walk into the steakhouse tonight feeling completely invincible, entirely convinced that they had already won the war before the first course was even served. The bag was completely empty, but the illusion it projected was heavy enough to sink them. I turned on my heel and walked back down the corridor, rolling my sleek suitcase smoothly behind me. The polyurethane wheels made a soft rhythmic hum against the hardwood floors. I found Vivian in the main living area. She was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows bathed in the late afternoon sunlight, meticulously adjusting a heavy diamond-encrusted clasp on her pearl necklace. She was wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown that draped elegantly over her frame. She looked powerful, regal, and terrifyingly demanding. I parked my luggage near the grand entryway and approached her quietly, projecting the exact aura of the compliant, eager daughter she required me to be. "Mother," I said softly, ensuring my tone was pitched to a deferential, agreeable level. She turned away from the window, her sharp eyes instantly dropping to evaluate my charcoal suit. Her lips twitched in a microscopic display of irritation that I had not changed into the soft pastel dress she had commanded me to wear. Before she could launch into a fresh wave of aggressive criticism, I deployed my countermeasure. "I am going to head to the restaurant early," I stated smoothly, stepping forward to adjust a slight twist in her pearl necklace, playing the role of the attentive caretaker. "I want to ensure the private dining room is set up perfectly for Darren's presentation. I need to verify the ambient lighting, confirm the sommelier has our wine pairings properly decanted, and make sure the seating arrangement places Calvin at the absolute head of the table where he belongs. We cannot leave anything to chance tonight." Vivian's irritation vanished instantly, entirely neutralized by the sheer level of subservience I was projecting. The idea that I was rushing ahead like an eager concierge to perfectly stage manage the room for their grand extortion plot deeply satisfied her ego. Her chest swelled with validation. She gave me a regal, approving nod. "That is highly appropriate, Nia," she declared, her voice dropping into a tone of supreme satisfaction. "Ensure they have the vintage Cabernet breathing immediately. And tell the maitre d' that we require absolute uninterrupted privacy once the business discussion begins. We cannot afford any distractions tonight." "I will handle every single detail, Mother," I replied, offering her a warm, entirely hollow smile. "I will see you all at 7. I turned away from her, grabbed the handle of my rolling luggage, and walked out of the massive mahogany double doors. The heavy brass latch clicked shut behind me, sealing my family inside the penthouse. I walked down the long, silent corridor to the private elevator bank. I pressed the call button and waited, my posture rigid, my breathing slow and completely controlled. The polished steel doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the ground floor lobby, and watched the digital floor indicator begin its rapid descent. The physical transition from the claustrophobic, toxic air of the penthouse to the cold, sharp reality of the outside world felt like shedding a heavy suit of lead armor. The elevator doors opened to the bustling, opulent lobby of the luxury high-rise. I bypassed the front desk entirely, rolling my suitcase across the polished marble floors and stepping out through the revolving glass doors into the biting, aggressive wind of the Chicago evening. The sky was already turning a deep, bruised purple. The city traffic roared around me, a chaotic symphony of engines and sirens. I pulled my heavy wool overcoat tight against the chill, walked to the edge of the curb, and pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket. I did not call a rideshare service. I pulled up my contacts and dialed the dedicated, unlisted number for my American Express Centurion concierge. The line rang exactly once before a crisp, highly professional voice answered. "Good afternoon, Ms. Williams. This is the Centurion concierge desk. How may I assist you today? I need to execute an immediate hard cancellation on the primary card, ending in 4102. I instructed, my voice cutting through the noise of the rushing traffic with absolute glacial precision. "Flag the account as compromised. I require you to instantly terminate all active authorizations, decline any pending incidental holds, and block all future transactions across the entire network." "Certainly, Ms. Williams," the concierge replied, the sound of rapid keystrokes echoing faintly over the line. "Executing a hard cancellation on card ending in 4102. The account is now flagged as compromised. All pending holds are currently being voided." I stood on the cold concrete curb and smiled. It was a small, sharp, deeply terrifying smile. By voiding the pending holds, the massive $15,000 incidental deposit I had placed on the penthouse suite was instantly erased. The thousands of dollars in exorbitant room service charges, the imported champagne Chloe had drained, the luxury spa bookings they had enjoyed, and the astronomical minibar tabs were all suddenly unbacked by any valid collateral. The hotel's automated accounting system would immediately trigger a high-priority financial alert. The management desk would be notified within seconds that the premier penthouse suite was currently occupied by guests utilizing a dead fraudulent payment method. The hotel's security and management teams would not wait. They would intercept my family the absolute second they stepped out of the elevator to leave for dinner. They would politely but firmly demand alternative payment for the massive outstanding balance. Darren could not pay it. His accounts were supposedly frozen by a massive cryptocurrency transfer. Chloe certainly could not pay it. She had never carried a credit card with a limit higher than $500. Calvin and Vivian would be forced to endure the profound public humiliation of having their pristine financial facade challenged in the middle of a crowded luxury lobby. They would be forced to scramble panic and empty their own severely depleted accounts just to walk out the front door. I terminated the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. The trap was sprung. The foundation of their evening was already collapsing, and they had absolutely no idea the true devastation was still waiting for them at the steakhouse. I gripped the handle of my luggage and began walking down the busy avenue, heading directly toward Gibson's Italia. I was not walking toward a family dinner. I was walking toward an execution. Gibson's Italia stood like a modern glass fortress against the dark, bruising sky of the Chicago evening. The massive restaurant radiated a warm, golden glow, a beacon of absolute exclusivity, perched directly on the edge of the Chicago River. I arrived precisely an hour early. I handed my rolling luggage to the impeccably dressed coat check attendant, tipping him a crisp $20 bill to keep it secure, and rode the private elevator up to the second-floor dining rooms. The private space I had secured was magnificent. It was a sprawling soundproof glass box suspended over the water, offering an unobstructed, glittering panoramic view of the city skyline. A massive polished oak table dominated the center of the room, set with heavy crystal glassware, polished silver, and low, fragrant floral arrangements that would not block eye contact across the board. I directed the waitstaff with the cold, unfeeling precision of a general arranging artillery on a battlefield. I was meticulously setting the stage for the final act. I arranged the seating chart to perfectly manipulate their massive egos. I positioned Calvin at the absolute head of the table, facing the spectacular view of the river, guaranteeing he felt like the supreme patriarch. I placed the three influential guest pastors directly flanking him, ensuring they were within his immediate sphere of influence. I seated Darren and Chloe across from the pastors, giving Darren the perfect stage to perform his pitch. Finally, I placed my own name card at the very end of the table, as far away from the seat of power as physically possible. I designed the visual optics to project the image of a quiet, submissive, entirely irrelevant observer. At 6:45, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. The three pastors arrived together: Reverend Miller, Bishop Hayes, and Pastor Evans. They were formidable heavyweights in the National Evangelical Circuit, men who commanded megachurches with thousands of congregants and held immense social and financial sway across the country. They wore tailored suits and heavy gold watches, carrying the distinct, intimidating aura of men who were used to being unquestioningly obeyed. I greeted them warmly, offered them vintage sparkling water, and played the role of the perfect accommodating host while we waited. At 7:15, the Williams family finally burst into the private room. The physical evidence of the hotel lobby interception was painted all over their faces. They were breathless, flushed, and radiating a frantic, highly toxic manic energy. Vivian's spectacular emerald green evening gown was slightly rumpled at the waist. Chloe's eyes were bloodshot and wide with residual panic. Calvin's forehead glistened with an undignified sheen of stress sweat, his booming voice slightly hoarse. Darren looked genuinely rattled, his usual arrogant, untouchable swagger completely replaced by the jerky, paranoid movements of a cornered animal. The hard cancellation of the credit card had clearly been a brutal, chaotic success. They had survived the sudden extortion attempt by the hotel management, likely by draining Calvin's emergency credit lines or emptying whatever liquid cash they had left, but the sheer public humiliation of the financial hemorrhage had deeply shaken their foundation. Despite their internal panic, they instantly plastered on their blinding megachurch smiles the second they saw the pastors. Calvin boomed his apologies aggressively, blaming the delay on atrocious Chicago traffic and incompetent drivers. The pastors nodded politely, their cold eyes calculating the frantic energy entering the room. The dinner commenced. Waiters in crisp white jackets circled the room like ghosts, pouring heavy $300 bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon and serving massive dry-aged steaks swimming in truffle butter. I ate my meal in total silence. I chewed my food methodically, keeping my eyes cast downward, perfectly projecting the image of a woman who knew her place. I watched the performance unfold from the periphery. Darren aggressively pivoted into his pitch halfway through the main course. He spoke in rapid, loud bursts, practically shouting over the clinking silver. He threw around complex tech buzzwords, talking about digital infrastructure, decentralized finance algorithms, blockchain tithing systems, and the future of global ministry expansion. He was trying to project the image of a visionary tech mogul, but the underlying desperation from the hotel incident bled through every single word. The pastors listened politely. They carved their steaks and sipped their wine, nodding along to Darren's frantic presentation. But their eyes remained cold, analytical, and completely unconvinced. They were seasoned, highly experienced businessmen hiding behind clerical collars. They were not easily swayed by loud buzzwords or Calvin's booming endorsements. They needed a guarantee. They needed solid, irrefutable collateral. They needed absolute proof that the Williams family possessed the financial solvency to back this massive commercial venture. The plates were cleared. Crystal glasses of aged single malt bourbon were distributed around the oak table. The room grew heavy and quiet, thick with the suffocating expectation of closing a high-stakes deal. Vivian recognized the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. She knew the pastors were not fully convinced by Darren's frantic energy. She knew she had to deploy her ultimate weapon to salvage the extortion plot. She had to publicly demonstrate that the Williams family possessed a massive, untapped reserve of liquid wealth. Furthermore, she had to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this wealth was entirely under Calvin and Darren's authoritative control. She had to offer me up as the sacrificial lamb. Vivian reached across the white linen tablecloth. Her manicured fingers closed around the stem of her heavy crystal water goblet. She picked up a polished silver dessert spoon with her other hand. She tapped the metal against the glass. The sharp ringing chimes sliced through the low hum of conversation like a scalpel. The sound was instantly commanding. The room fell completely silent. All eyes turned toward the matriarch of the Williams family. Vivian stood up slowly, her movements dramatic and fluid. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown, ensuring every eye was fixed directly upon her. She walked around the perimeter of the massive oak table, her expensive heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She stopped directly behind my chair, at the far end of the room. She placed a heavy, dominant hand squarely on my shoulder. Her grip was tight, her perfectly filed acrylic nails digging sharply into the fabric of my charcoal blazer. "Gentlemen," Vivian began. Her voice dropped into a rich theatrical vibrato, perfectly tuned for maximum emotional manipulation. "Before we discuss the future of our family's digital ministry and the specific financial structuring required, I want to take a moment to pray. I want to lift up my eldest daughter, Nia." She squeezed my shoulder hard, a physical command to remain perfectly still. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the white linen tablecloth, my face an impenetrable mask of quiet, total obedience. I let my shoulders slump forward, presenting the exact visual optic of a broken woman. Lord, Vivian prayed aloud, her booming voice filling every corner of the soundproof glass room. "We ask for your divine grace and infinite mercy tonight. We look at Nia, a woman who has achieved so much worldly corporate success, yet carries such a heavy, lonely soul. We pray for her isolated heart. We pray for her barren womb. We ask that you grant her the strength to accept the quiet, solitary path you have chosen for her." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the words hung suspended in the air. The silence in the room became absolute, thick and heavy with second-hand embarrassment. She was deliberately broadcasting my deepest, most agonizing private pain to powerful men I did not even know. She was using my divorce and my lack of children as a weapon to strip me of any perceived value or authority. She was publicly reducing me to an object of pity, but she was not finished. The true trap was just beginning. "Lord, we ask that you humble her fiercely independent spirit." Vivian continued, her grip on my shoulder, turning into a painful vice. "We ask that you give her the spiritual clarity to understand that true family security comes from proper submission. Her corporate wealth is a heavy burden for a woman standing alone. Grant her the grace to financially submit to the men of this family, the men who possess the vision, the wisdom, and the divine mandate to lead." Vivian explicitly extended her free hand, gesturing straight down the length of the table, pointing her finger directly at Darren. Give her the wisdom to surrender her earthly resources to her brother-in-law. Vivian prayed, her voice ringing with absolute toxic authority, so that he may multiply those resources for your greater kingdom. Give her the courage to sign over her burdens, so that this family may build a dynasty in your name. Amen. Amen. Calvin boomed from the head of the table, his deep voice vibrating against the glass windows. Amen. The three influential pastors echoed softly, bowing their heads in solemn, unified agreement with the matriarch's brutal assessment. The prayer concluded. Vivian removed her claws from my shoulder and glided gracefully back to her seat, a look of profound, victorious satisfaction glowing on her face. She had successfully framed my life's work as a tragic burden that needed to be managed by a man. She had given the pastors the exact collateral they required by publicly offering my corporate accounts as the backing for Darren's venture. The heavy silence returned to the private dining room. It was a suffocating, crushing pressure. The pastors slowly lifted their heads, turning their collective gaze down the length of the table to look directly at me. They fully expected me to bow my head in profound, humiliating shame. They expected me to shrink into my chair, spiritually broken and totally compliant. They had just watched my mother emotionally eviscerate me, and they expected the lonely, barren spinster to eagerly hand over her bank accounts just to buy her way back into her family's good graces. They expected me to surrender. Darren leaned back in his plush leather chair. The frantic, rattled energy from the hotel lobby disaster had completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming surge of toxic triumph. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. He had survived the hotel extortion, he had delivered his pitch, and his mother-in-law had just publicly handed him the keys to my kingdom. He flashed a brilliant predatory smirk, locking his eyes with mine across the crystal glasses and expensive floral arrangements. He moved slowly, savoring the absolute certainty of his victory. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavily stapled stack of corporate documents. It was the commercial consolidation loan contract. It was the financial instrument designed to legally bind my successful auditing company to his fraudulent debt. He placed the thick stack of papers deliberately on the center of the oak table, smoothing the cover page flat with the palm of his hand. He tapped the signature line twice with his index finger, grinning at me like a wolf who had finally cornered its prey. He was fully prepared to collect his prize. Darren's smirk hung in the air, a monument to his own towering hubris. I looked at the thick stack of paper resting on the polished oak table. The fraudulent commercial loan contract that was supposed to represent my financial enslavement. I looked at the heavy gold pen he slid across the smooth surface toward my right hand. Then I looked at the three powerful pastors, their eyes patiently waiting for my absolute submission. They expected tears. They expected me to shrink into the upholstery, spiritually broken and totally compliant. They expected the lonely, barren spinster to eagerly sign away her life's work just to buy her way back into her family's good graces. I did not shrink into my chair. I did not bow my head in shame. I placed my hands flat on the edge of the heavy wooden table and stood up. I rose slowly, my movements fluid and completely controlled, drawing my frame to its full height. My charcoal gray suit jacket caught the ambient light of the chandelier, the sharp tailoring projecting the exact, unyielding authority Vivian had desperately tried to suppress. The heavy silence in the room immediately shifted. It was no longer the silence of expectation. It became the silence of profound, immediate confusion. "Thank you for that deeply moving prayer, Mother," I said. My voice was not a whisper. It was not trembling. It was a cold, resonant bell ringing through the center of the soundproof glass box. The sheer volume and absolute steadiness of my tone physically startled Bishop Hayes, causing him to sit back in his leather chair. I maintained unbroken eye contact with the head of the table. However, before we discuss my barren womb, I believe the church board would be highly interested in the $150,000 missing from the youth center fund. See. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Calvin's face drained of all color, transforming from a flush, healthy brown to a sickly, ashen gray in less than a second. The booming, authoritative patriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating old man. Vivian let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying up to clutch her diamond-encrusted pearls, as if she had been physically struck. Chloe froze completely, her champagne flute hovering halfway to her mouth, the liquid sloshing over the crystal rim and dripping onto the white linen tablecloth. Darren's smug, predatory grin shattered into a million pieces. His jaw dropped open, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors as the blood rushed from his head. I reached down into the structured leather tote resting at my feet. I bypassed my tablet and my cosmetic bag. I withdrew the thick, heavy stack of printed forensic audit files I had meticulously compiled that morning. They were bound in stark black folders, the edges perfectly aligned. I placed them onto the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. Next, I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. I withdrew the encrypted silver USB drive. I set it gently on top of the black folders. The metal caught the reflection of the lighting above us, gleaming like a drawn blade. I pushed the heavy stack of folders down the length of the polished oak. They glided smoothly, coming to a dead stop exactly inches from Reverend Miller's water goblet. Bishop Hayes and Pastor Evans immediately leaned in, their brows furrowing in deep suspicion. "I did not come here to invest in a digital dynasty," I stated, pacing my words with a steady, relentless rhythm. "I came here to deliver a forensic autopsy. Reverend Miller, if you open the first black folder, you will find the complete, unaltered digital wire transfer logs pulled directly from the church's internal accounting system. You will see 18 distinct, unauthorized transfers initiated over the last 18 months. I have highlighted the exact routing numbers. Every single transaction bypassed your secondary security protocols and funneled cash directly out of the congregation's reach." Reverend Miller's hands shook slightly as he flipped open the heavy black cover. Bishop Hayes and Pastor Evans crowded his shoulders, their eyes scanning the stark, undeniable spreadsheets. "Notice the dates?" I instructed, stepping fully into my element as an executioner. "October 14th, $22,000. December 2nd, $15,000. February 18th, $30,000. The routing numbers listed next to those outbound transfers all end in 4409 and 8112. Turn to page 3. You will see the official banking charters. Those destination accounts do not belong to vendor services or community outreach programs. Those 3 destination accounts belong exclusively to Darren Vance." Darren opened his mouth to speak, a desperate, strangled sound escaping his throat, but Pastor Evans shot him a look of such absolute, terrifying rage that Darren instantly snapped his mouth shut, sinking back into his chair. Page 4 contains the corresponding American Express credit card statements and bank withdrawal slips. I continued, my voice locking onto Darren like a targeting system. "The stolen community funds were immediately utilized to finance his personal lifestyle. You are looking at extensive luxury travel to South Beach, high-end retail purchases at Chanel and Dior, and dual spa reservations at 5-star resorts. None of these expenses relate to the digital ministry expansion he just pitched to you. He has been systematically bleeding your congregation dry to fund a double life." The clinking of silverware had stopped completely. The low hum of the restaurant's HVAC system suddenly seemed deafening. The smell of expensive dry-aged steak turned to ash in the air. "But the forensic trail does not end with the thief," I said, turning my gaze away from Darren and directing it entirely onto my parents. Vivian was shaking violently, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. Calvin was gripping the edge of the heavy oak table so hard his knuckles were turning white, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. When Calvin and Vivian discovered this massive felony embezzlement 3 months ago, they did not report it to the board. I stated, laying out the final devastating piece of the puzzle. They did not alert the authorities. They chose to protect the criminal, to preserve their own flawless public image. They could not stomach the humiliation of a scandal, so they actively engaged in a massive financial cover-up. I pointed toward the folders resting under Reverend Miller's hands. Bishop Hayes turned to page 9. You will find a verified stamped copy of the most recent property deed filings for Fulton County, Georgia, pulled directly from the public registry. Bishop Hayes turned the pages quickly, the sound of thick paper rustling aggressively in the quiet room. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes widening in horror as he read the highlighted text. 3 months ago, Calvin and Vivian Williams quietly authorized a high-risk predatory second mortgage against their fully paid-off family estate. I recited, delivering the catastrophic numbers from memory. They leveraged the entire debt-free value of their home to secure a $200,000 emergency commercial loan. They utilized that cash to secretly replace the missing church funds, desperately attempting to cover Darren's tracks and balance the ledger before your upcoming annual audit. I let the magnitude of the betrayal hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. The three pastors sat in stunned, horrified silence. The initial confusion on their faces had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, righteous, absolute fury. The spiritual leaders of the community realized they had been lied to, manipulated, and invited to a dinner designed by hypocrites. They are currently drowning in a toxic monthly payment they cannot afford on a pastoral salary, I explained, gesturing down at the commercial loan contract Darren had proudly placed on the table just minutes ago. This entire dinner, this fraudulent tech pitch, and that beautiful performative prayer to humble my spirit was an elaborate extortion plot. They brought me here to trick me into attaching my pristine auditing firm and my verified revenue streams to a massive consolidation loan. They intended to drain my corporate credit to bail themselves out of the catastrophic debt they incurred to protect an embezzler. I looked at Vivian, my eyes devoid of any lingering daughterly affection. You did not want me to wear a corporate suit today because you did not want me thinking like an auditor. You wanted me soft, pliable, and desperate for your blessing so I would sign my life away without reading the fine print. You prayed for my submission so I would finance your lies. Reverend Miller slowly closed the black folder. He placed his hands flat on top of the leather binder. He did not look at Calvin. He did not look at Vivian. He stared directly at Darren with eyes that promised complete, unmitigated destruction. Pastor Evans, who had personally championed the Youth Center Fund for the last decade, looked as though he was ready to physically vault across the table. "Calvin," Reverend Miller said. His voice was dangerously quiet, lacking any of the usual pastoral warmth. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. "Is this true? Did you mortgage your home to hide a theft from this church?" Calvin opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a deflated balloon, his massive frame shrinking into the upholstery. He looked to Vivian for help, but the matriarch was completely paralyzed, staring at the forensic files as if they were venomous snakes. The silver drive contains the encrypted raw data files, digital receipts, and photographic evidence of Darren's secondary lifestyle in Miami. I added, breaking the suffocating tension. I suggest the board retain independent legal counsel immediately. The paper trail is permanent and the numbers are absolute. There is no room for denial. Darren finally panicked. The illusion of his genius completely dissolved, leaving only the frantic terror of a man realizing he was going to federal prison. He lunged forward, his hands scrambling across the oak table, desperately trying to snatch the black folders back from Reverend Miller. "It is a lie!" Darren shouted, his voice cracking, completely losing his composure. "She is lying. She is a bitter, jealous woman trying to destroy my family. Give me those files." Pastor Evans stood up immediately, blocking Darren's reach with his own substantial frame. "Sit down, son," Pastor Evans commanded, his voice echoing like thunder. "You will not touch these documents." I picked up my briefcase, the leather handle cool and familiar against my palm. The execution was complete. The infection had been surgically removed from my life, and the burden of cleaning up the bloody aftermath now rested firmly on the shoulders of the church board. I had kept my vow. No one was going to steal from me and walk away breathing. "Enjoy your dinner," I said, my voice echoing calmly in the chaotic room. "I will let you handle the check." Darren vaulted out of his plush leather chair, the sudden violent movement sending the heavy mahogany frame crashing backward into the soundproof glass wall. The dull thud echoed through the room, a jarring counterpoint to the absolute stillness of the three pastors. "She is lying," Darren roared, a fine mist of spit flying from his lips. The polished, charismatic tech visionary had completely vanished, replaced by a frantic, sweating, cornered animal. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with a panicked, erratic rhythm. His custom-tailored suit suddenly seemed to hang poorly on his frame, the fabric unable to conceal the frantic, vibrating terror seizing his muscles. "You are going to listen to this bitter, crazy woman," he demanded, sweeping his gaze across the three powerful clergymen, his voice pitching upward into a shrill, hysterical register. "Look at her. She is completely unhinged. She is completely jealous. She lost her own husband to another woman. She lost her career, and now she is trying to destroy my family out of pure, unadulterated spite. It is a fabrication. Every single spreadsheet in those folders is a digitally altered, fabricated lie." He looked desperately toward Calvin for backup, but the booming patriarch of the Williams family was completely catatonic, his jaw slack, his eyes glazed over in profound shock. Darren turned back to the pastors, holding his hands out with his palms facing upward in a pathetic gesture of manufactured innocence. "Reverend Miller Bishop Hayes, you know my heart," Darren pleaded, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his collapsing reality. "You know my divine vision for this ministry. I am moving millions in digital assets across secure blockchain networks. I am building the future of global evangelism. She does not understand complex, decentralized finance. She is just a sad, barren spinster who cannot stand to see her sister thriving in a blessed, highly prosperous marriage." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of defense against his pathetic, misogynistic tirade. I simply remained standing at the end of the long oak table, perfectly still, letting his frantic shouting echo against the glass walls until the silence eventually returned. The quiet that followed his outburst was heavier, colder, and infinitely more damning than before. I slowly turned my body away from the furious, calculating stares of the three pastors. I shifted my physical focus and my icy, unyielding gaze entirely onto my younger sister. Chloe sat completely paralyzed in her chair. The expensive vintage champagne she had carelessly sloshed over the rim of her crystal flute earlier was slowly soaking into the sleeve of her designer silk blouse, but she did not seem to register the damp, uncomfortable chill against her skin. Her wide, terrified eyes darted frantically back and forth between the stark black audit folders resting firmly under Reverend Miller's large hands and the sweating, unhinged, screaming man she had chosen to marry. She was desperately searching for a lifeline. She was looking for a plausible excuse to cling to a convenient lie she could use to patch the massive gaping hole blowing through the hull of her perfect, curated lifestyle. But the foundation of her manufactured reality was rapidly, violently crumbling beneath her expensive heels. I stepped closer to her, my posture projecting absolute, unshakable authority. When I spoke, my voice dropped into a calm, conversational, almost intimate tone. It was the precise, lethal tone of an executive auditor delivering a final, irrefutable finding of catastrophic fraud. "He is right, Chloe," I said smoothly, letting the unexpected validation hang suspended in the tense air for a fraction of a second. I watched her pupils dilate as her brain desperately tried to process the statement. "He did not put the money in cryptocurrency." I clarified my words, slicing through her confusion with surgical precision. "He put it on Tiffany's finger." Chloe's breath caught sharply in her throat, a harsh, jagged sound. The color completely instantaneously drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a fragile, hollow porcelain doll. "You remember that spectacular 3-carat flawless emerald-cut diamond Tiffany flaunted at the country club brunch last month?" I asked, watching the exact memory violently crash behind my sister's panicked eyes. I watched her mentally rewind the timeline, replaying the brunch, the mimosa glasses, the blinding sparkle of the stone her best friend had waved in her face. The one she coyly claimed was an early anniversary gift from a mysterious, highly successful benefactor. I continued twisting the knife with slow, methodical intent. "Paid for by your husband, out of your father's community youth center fund, during their intensive week-long spiritual leadership conference in Miami." I watched the invisible gears in Chloe's mind snap into place with brutal, unforgiving clarity. Tiffany was her former maid of honor. She was her supposed best friend, her closest confidant, the woman who had stood beside her at the altar, and sworn her loyalty. I had meticulously, exhaustively tracked the offshore wire transfers directly from the church's accounts to a boutique, ultra-exclusive jeweler located in the heart of South Beach. I had matched the purchase date and the timestamp of the transaction perfectly with the weekend Darren had claimed to be networking with high-net-worth evangelical tech investors. The puzzle was entirely complete and the picture it formed was absolute catastrophic devastation. A sound escaped Chloe's throat that I had never heard before in my entire life. It was not a delicate cry. It was not a performative dramatic sob. It was a guttural, primal, deeply terrifying screech of pure, unadulterated, savage rage. The delicate, perfectly poised, holier-than-thou mega-church princess completely vanished into the ether. Chloe lunged across the polished oak table with the blinding, explosive ferocity of a starving predator. She did not hesitate. Her manicured hands bypassed the heavy silver cutlery and the crystal water goblets, entirely launching her body forward, aiming directly for Darren's throat. She collided with him in a violent tangle of limbs, sending them both crashing backward into the heavy mahogany serving cart positioned behind his chair. A massive polished silver platter piled high with premium dry-aged tomahawk steaks and roasted truffle-infused asparagus shattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. A $300 bottle of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon tipped over in the chaos, the dark, blood-red liquid pouring rapidly across the pristine white linen tablecloth, soaking into the fabric like a freshly opened arterial wound. Darren scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the rich truffle butter slicking the floor. He threw his arms up over his head, desperately trying to shield his face from his wife's manicured, slashing claws. Chloe was relentlessly shrieking Tiffany's name at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing off the glass walls. She tore at Darren's tailored suit jacket, her acrylic nails hooking into the expensive fabric and ripping the lapel clean off the shoulder seam with a harsh, tearing sound. Vivian did not move to help her daughter. She did not attempt to stop the violent, humiliating domestic assault unfolding in the center of the exclusive five-star dining room. Vivian's entirely self-serving reptilian survival instinct hijacked her brain. Her pristine, regal, untouchable facade shattered completely into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. She realized with blinding clarity that her social standing, her immense wealth, and her absolute authority were currently resting inside the black folders on the table. She lunged forward, throwing her upper body desperately across the blood-red wine stains spreading across the linen. She stretched her arms out, her heavy diamond bracelets scraping harshly against the wood, her fingers clawing frantically toward the forensic audit files still resting peacefully in front of the three pastors. "Give them to me!" Vivian shrieked, her voice hoarse, feral, and completely unrecognizable from the smooth, theatrical vibrato she had used to loudly pray for my financial submission just minutes prior. "Those are private family documents. You have absolutely no right to look at those. Hand them over." She managed to hook one perfectly polished, emerald green fingernail onto the edge of the top folder, preparing to yank the evidence away, but Bishop Hayes was significantly faster. He slammed his heavy, gold-ringed hand down directly onto the black binder, pinning it to the oak table with absolute, unyielding, punishing force. Pastor Evans immediately stood up and stepped forcefully in front of Reverend Miller, utilizing his broad shoulders to form a physical, intimidating barricade between the desperate, clawing matriarch and the concrete forensic evidence of her family's profound, sickening corruption. "Do not touch these files, Vivian," Bishop Hayes rumbled, his deep voice dripping with profound, absolute, icy disgust. He looked down at her sprawled across the wine-soaked table, as if she were a diseased roach scurrying across the floor. "This is no longer a private family matter. This is a highly documented criminal investigation regarding the felony theft of our congregation's sacred offerings." Calvin remained glued to his chair at the head of the table. The supreme patriarch, the booming voice of undeniable moral authority, was utterly, helplessly paralyzed. He was clutching his chest with both hands, his mouth opening and closing in rapid succession like a suffocating fish pulled onto dry land. He could not look his fellow pastors in the eye. He was forced to sit in silence and witness the real-time, irreversible, spectacular annihilation of his entire legacy. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room suddenly swung wide open. A terrified waiter drawn by the sound of shattering porcelain crashing furniture and feral screaming stood frozen in the threshold. He stared wide-eyed at the absolute savage carnage unfolding inside the exclusive glass box. Chloe was now hurling heavy crystal water goblets directly at Darren's head, forcing him to cower pathetically behind an overturned leather dining chair. Vivian was weeping hysterically, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks, as she clawing uselessly at the oak table, while Bishop Hayes stood over her, like an uncompromising sentinel of justice. Calvin was hyperventilating, his eyes rolling back in his head. I smoothed the front of my charcoal blazer entirely unbothered by the savage animalistic destruction occurring mere inches from my feet. I caught the terrified waiter's eye across the room and raised a single calm, authoritative finger to flag his attention. He stepped forward hesitantly, his hands visibly trembling against his silver service tray. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out a crisp, newly minted $20 bill. I leaned over and placed it gently on the only clean, dry corner of the oak table, remaining smoothing it perfectly flat next to my untouched glass of imported sparkling water. I turned my attention back to the room at large. My voice easily sliced through the chaotic, deafening symphony of Chloe's violent screaming, Darren's pathetic, cowardly begging, and Vivian's feral, hopeless sobbing. I have already emailed encrypted high-resolution copies of these exact audit files to the Financial Crimes Division of the Chicago Police Department, as well as the Regional Fraud Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service. I announced delivering the final lethal, uncompromising blow to their rapidly burning empire. Reverend Miller looked up from the black folders, his eyes meeting mine through the chaos. He did not speak, but he gave me a slow, solemn nod of profound, undeniable respect. He understood exactly what I had done, the meticulous trap I had set, and he understood the immense, uncompromising strength it took to execute it. "Enjoy the appetizers," I said lightly, my voice floating above the screaming. I turned my back on the smoking wreckage of the Williams family. I stepped gracefully over a shattered crystal wine glass, the shards crunching softly beneath my sole, and walked smoothly past the terrified waiter standing in the doorway. I gripped the handle of my rolling luggage, the polyurethane wheels humming softly efficiently against the polished marble flooring of the outer corridor. My tailored suit felt perfectly light. My posture was impeccably rigidly straight. My heels clicked with a sharp, rhythmic, undeniable authority, echoing loudly down the long, opulent hallway as I walked out of Gibson's Italia, leaving the burning, irreparable ruins of their dynasty far behind me. 2 hours later, the chaotic, freezing wind of downtown Chicago was replaced by the serene, pressurized environment of a Delta Airlines Boeing 737. I sat comfortably reclined in Seat 2A of the first-class cabin heading straight back to Atlanta. The ambient lighting of the cabin cast a warm golden glow over the pristine leather seating. The flight attendant, a polite woman with a warm, genuine smile, handed me a chilled gin martini with a single olive. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The gin burned pleasantly down my throat, a crisp and clear celebration of absolute, unrestricted freedom. Below me, the sprawling, illuminated grid of the city lights faded into the dark, expansive canvas of the night sky. I was no longer a subservient auditor acting as a compliant daughter. I was a sovereign entity entirely detached from the toxic gravity of the Williams family. The quiet luxury of the first-class cabin was abruptly interrupted by a sudden, harsh vibration against my thigh. My encrypted smartphone lit up the darkened space, vibrating violently against the fabric of my trousers. The caller ID flashed Calvin's name in bright, demanding letters. He was calling from a secondary number 1 that I had not yet permanently blocked. I allowed the phone to vibrate 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation radiating through the digital signal. On the 4th ring, I swiped the screen and brought the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. I did not say a single word. I simply listened to the heavy, hyperventilating silence on the other end. Calvin's booming, authoritative pastoral baritone had completely disintegrated. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged, high-pitched shriek that painfully distorted the audio receiver. "Where the hell are you?" he screamed, the sheer volume forcing me to hold the device an inch away from my ear. "You ruined us. You completely ruined us. I took another smooth, unhurried sip of my martini. The ice-cold gin tasted like absolute undeniable victory. Take a guess, I answered, my voice pitched to a low melodic purr. Did the family enjoy the gift I left behind? Before Calvin could formulate a response, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror erupted through the receiver. It was Vivian. Her voice tore through the background, a feral, agonizing shriek of total catastrophic devastation. "Oh my God, what is this?" she wailed, her pristine, manufactured composure entirely obliterated. I knew exactly what she was screaming about. I closed my eyes and visualized the scene unfolding in the master suite of the penthouse. They had rushed back to the hotel, likely fleeing the disastrous wreckage of Gibson's Italia, in a state of blind panic, desperate to regroup and plot their revenge. They had stormed into the bedroom and seen that pristine, bright red Hermes shopping bag sitting right in the center of the mattress. They had greedily torn into the heavy packaging, expecting to find an exorbitant apology gift, a diamond bracelet, or a stack of banded emergency cash. Instead, they found a waking nightmare. The bag did not contain a luxury purse. It contained a thick, neatly bound portfolio of printed, high-resolution photographs. I had utilized a highly discreet private investigator to meticulously track Darren's movements during his supposed spiritual leadership conference. The 8x10 glossies clearly depicted Darren and Tiffany embracing passionately on a private balcony in Miami, drinking expensive champagne and browsing the diamond selection at a high-end South Beach jeweler. Directly beneath those devastating photographs lay a freshly printed, legally binding document from the Internal Revenue Service. It was a formal stamped notice of a massive tax lien that I had personally triggered against their pristine Atlanta estate. I had utilized the exact financial discrepancies and unauthorized transfers I had uncovered during my audit of the church's books to alert the federal authorities. The document explicitly detailed the immediate, uncompromising seizure of their assets to cover the fraudulent commercial loan Calvin had secretly authorized. And resting at the very bottom of the red bag was a single sheet of heavy ivory corporate stationery. The note was handwritten in my precise, elegant cursive. It contained a simple, straightforward message informing them that the $15,000 incidental deposit for the penthouse suite had been permanently revoked. Through the phone's receiver, the sound of the Williams family violently turning on each other escalated into a deafening, animalistic roar. Chloe was shrieking at Darren, the sound of breaking glass and shattering porcelain echoing sharply in the background as she tore the suite apart. Calvin was weeping uncontrollably, the ruined patriarch mourning the sudden death of his empire. But cutting through the center of their savage domestic war was a new, harsh, unfamiliar voice. It was the booming, authoritative shout of the hotel's head of security. I could hear the heavy boots of the security details storming into the master suite. I could hear the hotel manager firmly, aggressively demanding immediate payment for the room and the damages Chloe was currently inflicting. I listened with profound, deep-seated satisfaction as the security team ordered my family to pack their belongings immediately. Because I had revoked my card, the management was currently throwing the Williams family their expensive luggage, their ruined Sunday best, and their completely shattered egos straight out of the opulent lobby and into the freezing, relentless Chicago rain. They had absolutely nowhere to go. Their credit cards were completely useless, their bank accounts were actively flagged for fraud, and their untouchable social standing was utterly destroyed. The fortress they had built on lies had collapsed directly on top of them. I sat back in my plush first-class seat. I did not offer an explanation. I did not offer a final dramatic parting word. I simply removed the phone from my ear and calmly pressed the red button to terminate the call. I opened the side compartment of the device and extracted the tiny plastic SIM card. I pinched the delicate square of plastic between my thumb and forefinger, applied a sharp, deliberate pressure, and snapped it cleanly in half. I dropped the broken pieces directly into the bottom of my empty martini glass. The plastic clicked softly against the crystal. I looked out the small oval window at the endless expanse of the night sky, watching the clouds part to reveal a brilliant shining moon. They always say a black woman has to be strong enough to carry her family. They are right. I was strong enough to carry myself right out the door and let the dead weight sink, fade to black.